Hey guys, tonight we are quietly slipping into a world of bed curtains, cold stone floors, and a whole lot of misunderstanding. Yes, we're talking about what sex was really like in medieval times. Not the spicy fanfiction version, not the HBO fog and candles version. The actual, awkward, uncomfortable, church-regulated reality of medieval intimacy. The kind that happens under wool blankets in shared rooms, while a goat bleeds somewhere nearby and a monk is probably watching disapprovingly from a tapestry. You've got a straw mattress, a vague sense of what's anatomically correct, and the priest telling you not to enjoy anything too much. It's not exactly a romantic setting, but it is human and weirdly funny. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a small wooden room, probably shared with at least one sibling, a few chickens, and maybe a cousin who talks in his sleep. Privacy, not really a thing. Beds, technically yes, but more like wooden frames with ropes and stuffed sacks of hay or straw. And if you're lucky, you have a curtain to pull around it. Not for luxury, just to keep the worst of the drafts from freezing your elbows off. The medieval bed was less a boudoir and more a cramped wagon stop. But let's say you're married now, which was generally the only time sex was officially permitted, and it's your wedding night. Congratulations. The in-laws might be waiting outside the room, possibly holding candles, possibly waiting for evidence of consummation. Because yes, sometimes bed sheets were checked. You probably won't survive this level of pressure. The church was extremely involved in everyone's love life, or at least in limiting it. Certain days were off limits, like Lent, or Advent, or Fridays, or Sundays, or feast days, or days when you were fasting, praying, mildly unwell, or just suspiciously cheerful. Basically, unless it was raining and the cow was facing east, you were probably doing something forbidden.
As for positions, there was only one considered morally acceptable. Anything else was frowned upon, and probably blamed for crop failures or heresy. The missionary position was approved because it was orderly, face-to-face, and, easier to supervise in woodcut illustrations. Historians still argue whether this strictness actually played out in everyday lives, or whether folks just nodded at the rules and then did what they liked once the priest left. Clothing, meanwhile, was optional, but many kept a shift or chemise on for warmth. Heating was rare. Fireplaces weren't even common until later in the Middle Ages, so your choices were get undressed and freeze, or stay partially dressed and still freeze, but with slightly more modesty. Oh, and you had to be sober. Drunkenness voided consent in the eyes of the church, which is rich, considering how much mead people consume to get through winter. If one of you had just eaten garlic or eel, it might be considered bad luck to proceed. Garlic was seen as passion-inducing, eel, not so much. And don't forget the neighbors. In close-knit villages with thatched cottages and thin walls, everyone knew what was going on. The sounds, the creaks, the whispered arguments over whose turn it was to fetch water, none of it went unnoticed. Gossip was a medieval sport, and your nocturnal habits could end up in someone's sermon. But even in all this awkwardness, there's tenderness. Historical records mention love poems carved into wood, tokens exchanged in secret, and songs sung softly when no one else could hear. Human connection persisted, sometimes in spite of the rules, sometimes because of them. You might also want to remember to hang a cloth over the window, not for modesty, but because in some regions, open windows were believed to let in night air, which was thought to sap your energy and ruin your fertility. A chilly draft? Maybe. A fertility thief? Probably not. But try arguing with medieval superstition when your window's just a hole in the wall. And then there's the mattress. It squeaks, loudly. No one's fixing it, because tools are expensive, and you borrowed the bed from your uncle's neighbor's cousin. It pokes you in weird places and sheds hay into your hair, but it's all you've got. There's something oddly endearing about making it work anyway. Just don't expect rose petals, silk sheets, or soft lighting. You get a candle stub and a prayer that the goat doesn't knock it over. Love is not always in the air. More often, it's trudging through the mud with a basket of turnips and a letter stitched into a sleeve. Courtship in the medieval world wasn't exactly candlelit dinners and long walks by the moat. It was more like trying to woo someone while her father stood 2 feet away, sharpening a sickle. Romance had rules and paperwork, and occasionally livestock involved in the dowry. If you were lucky, you got to pick your partner, but most people didn't. Marriages were arranged early and sealed with contracts that read more like livestock sales than love stories. 1 ewe, 3 acres, and a niece. Very romantic. The church encouraged marriage as a moral safeguard against sinful urges, but the couple's opinion wasn't always the priority, especially among the wealthy or titled. Still, humans being humans, love found loopholes. You'd see tokens exchanged, a ribbon, a carved spoon, a particularly nice onion. Yes, onions were courtship currency in some villages, sweet-smelling and useful in soup. What's not to love? Many lovers relied on go-betweens, helpful friends or siblings who carried notes and messages. Occasionally, these messages were tucked into food, literally baked into pies or hidden inside bread loaves. The bread of love, you might say, until someone bites into a wax seal and breaks a molar. There were songs too, ballads sung under windows or muttered into the breeze. A bard might even be hired to serenade, though many were unreliable and prone to rewriting verses based on who paid them most recently. One moment you're the light of his life, the next you're as fair as a plump goose. The church frowned on casual dalliance, and yet people still flirted behind linen stalls and arranged accidental encounters at the well. A popular move, dropping a bucket and needing help retrieving it. Not subtle, but effective. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuinely spontaneous or just cleverly repeated scripts everyone knew. Of course, once the match was made, you had to announce it, usually with a public betrothal. This could involve a formal ceremony, hand-fasting, tying the couple's hands together, or just loudly yelling about it in the town square until someone took notes. Marriage wasn't just about affection. It was a business partnership, an economic deal, and a moral commitment, all rolled into one. Which sounds intense until you realize many people got married at 13. In modern terms, that's middle school with tax implications. But not everyone followed the rules. Some couples eloped. Some had secret unions blessed by rebellious priests. Others got hand-fasted in private, swore fidelity before a candle, and hoped no one asked too many questions. Love was sneaky. It had to be. One record even mentions a man who disguised himself as a nun just to be near the woman he adored. Bold, uncomfortable, probably very itchy. Physical affection before marriage was discouraged. Technically, even holding hands was pushing it. But again, technicalities were often ignored. Local customs varied. Some communities believed you could test the waters with a bundling ritual. The couple would spend the night together, fully clothed, under strict supervision. Sometimes with a wooden board between them. Sometimes with their legs tied together. Sounds awkward? That's because it was. Still, these measures were taken seriously. A child born out of wedlock could spell disaster for a family's reputation. The baby might be called a love child, but no one was cooing about it on Instagram. Families could be fined. Marriages could be annulled. Dowries could be voided. That turnip basket? Gone. Even names carried meaning. Surnames like Loveless, Goodfellow, or Kissam might hint at romantic histories. Some scholars even believe that court rolls, early legal documents, read like soap operas. Case after case of so-and-so promised to marry but ran off with the shepherd's apprentice. Basically, drama. Among peasants, courtship rituals were often more practical. A man might prove his intentions by helping fix a fence or by bringing extra firewood during winter. There's something endearing about romance expressed through chopped logs and mended thatch. Not flashy, but sincere. Urban settings introduced new dynamics. In towns, apprentices and maidservants mingled more freely. Markets bustled, and eyes met over cabbages and salted fish. Brothels were also common, and while technically frowned upon, they were tolerated in many places, especially if they stayed in their designated alleys. Speaking of alleyways, love letters written in Latin were fashionable among the educated, though many simply copied from books. Plagiarism wasn't a crime of the heart, just a practical shortcut. One surviving letter simply reads, "Your eyes are brighter than any fish lantern." We don't know what that means, but it was probably heartfelt. And then there's the role of festivals. May Day, Midsummer, harvest feasts. These were all prime matchmaking events, with dancing and cider, and people getting bolder than usual because they'd eaten too much honey bread. Many suspiciously early weddings occurred after these events. Historians call this the May baby phenomenon. No judgment. Courtship wasn't always fair, of course. Power dynamics mattered. Some noblemen used their status to pressure or coerce. Women, especially of lower status, had limited recourse. That's the darker edge of this history. But many still found ways to assert choice, push back, and demand dignity. Their stories, whispered, scribbled, half erased, deserve to be heard gently.
And so, somewhere in a smoky village or under a moonlit rampart, you hear soft footsteps. Two people meeting where no one else is watching. A shared smile, a loaf of bread exchanged, a ribbon tucked beneath a sleeve, a promise, fragile, hopeful, stubborn. Married life begins not with fireworks, but with candle stubs, a shared wooden bowl, and possibly someone else's goat chewing your laundry. You've officially crossed the threshold, literally, into a home that might be your in-laws' spare loft, or a hut cobbled together from leftover timber and prayers. There's a hearth, a bed you both don't quite fit in, and the ongoing soundtrack of someone sneezing in the next house over. Welcome to matrimony. In medieval times, the average couple didn't exactly lounge around in romantic bliss. Life was full of chores, debt, weather, and that one neighbor who always borrowed your bucket and never returned it. But beneath all that was companionship, sometimes awkward, sometimes sweet, sometimes just about surviving winter without arguing over whose turn it was to shake the lice out of the bedding. Roles in marriage were generally divided. The man was expected to earn or produce, farming, blacksmithing, weaving if he was trained. The woman, everything else. Cooking, cleaning, brewing ale, spinning, sewing, raising children, nursing chickens back to health, and maintaining a perfectly passive expression, while her husband explained that the cow just needs more oats. Still, these roles weren't always rigid. In some towns, women ran businesses, managed shops, or owned property outright. One record from 14th century York lists a woman as a beer wife, a brewer so successful she had 2 assistants and a cat listed as a dependent. Historians still argue whether this flexibility was widespread or just regional quirks. And yes, children followed soon after marriage, usually because birth control options were sparse. There were folk remedies, of course. Herbs like pennyroyal or rue were believed to prevent pregnancy, but results varied wildly. Some methods involved wearing amulets or reciting specific prayers backwards. Others included truly bizarre practices, like carrying a weasel's bone in your shoe. Nothing says family planning like weasel bones. Pregnancy itself was not exactly a candlelit glow moment. You worked right up to labor, fetching water, tending fields, churning butter,
until suddenly you weren't. Then, the midwife arrived. Maybe your sister came to hold your hand, and you gave birth with no anesthesia and lots of prayers. Men were usually not in the room, not out of modesty, more because they were nervous wrecks and kept fainting near the stew pot. If the baby lived, a hasty baptism followed, sometimes within hours. Infant mortality was tragically high, and the church taught that unbaptized souls might not find rest. It's grim, but it also meant that even the sternest priest would sprint through town in the rain to bless a squirming, red-faced bundle. You'll be glad to know that some parishes actually had little cloaks for emergency baptisms. Holy couture.
Romance in married life varied wildly. Some couples grew genuinely fond of each other, writing letters, trading jokes, even slipping little carved trinkets into pockets. Others were more businesslike, managing land and children like co-CEOs of a barely profitable farm. And then there were the rougher cases, unhappy marriages, arranged ones, or unions where affection never had a chance to bloom, but humor persisted. One 15th century manuscript includes marginal notes where a monk doodled a wife hitting her husband with a ladle, a domestic squabble immortalized in ink. Another record describes a husband who tried to impress his wife by baking bread, only to set the roof on fire. She forgave him, eventually. Even within marriage, sex came with rules. You couldn't be intimate during major fasts, after certain foods, or before big religious events, and it was meant for procreation, not for pleasure. But medieval folks weren't robots. They found their own rhythms, balancing belief with instinct, duty with desire. Some couples even sought bed advice from their confessors, leading to uncomfortable conversations like, "Well, Father, he insists on humming before, and I just don't think it's holy." Physical affection wasn't limited to the bed. In many households, spouses shared labor carrying baskets together, folding linens, tending gardens. There's something quiet and touching about a couple pausing mid-chore to exchange a look or a joke. The romance of routine. We often imagine medieval people as grim, solemn, or perpetually tired, and yes, they had reasons to be all of that. But they also laughed, teased, stole kisses behind hay bales, hid love notes in recipe scrolls. One Flemish woman reportedly signed off her letter to her husband with, "Do not let the goat eat this." A love note and a reminder all in one. Evenings were quiet, without screens or books in every home. Entertainment came from each other. Stories, riddles, maybe a fiddle if you were lucky. Sitting close by the fire, shelling peas or mending socks, you might reach over and rest your hand on theirs. No grand gesture, just warmth in the cold. And sometimes, when the chores were done, the neighbors asleep, and the hearth still glowing faintly, you'd lie in your shared bed, back to back at first, then inch closer. Maybe you'd whisper about next year's barley, or your daughter's lopsided drawing of a sheep, or nothing at all. Just two people, trying to make sense of life, side by side on a mattress stuffed with hay and good intentions. Now let's talk about the part no one wrote much down about, but everyone definitely thought about. Despite what medieval sermons might have implied, people were, in fact, very curious about their own bodies. Unfortunately, the church had a habit of sighing dramatically every time someone asked, "So, what's normal?" Sex education in medieval Europe came from a grab bag of sources: medical texts, moral tracts, local gossip, and your Aunt Maud's wildly inaccurate advice. The church believed marital intimacy was acceptable, so long as it was for procreation, occurred on the right days, and didn't involve excessive enthusiasm. Basically, dim the candles, no humming, and try not to enjoy it too much. And yet, people clearly tried to understand themselves and each other better. One medical manuscript from the 14th century describes the humors of lust as a bodily wind that needed to be balanced by diet and prayer. Another suggested that a woman's complexion could change based on how recently she had embraced her husband. One scribe even warned against garlic,
claiming it led to unseemly vigor. Some monasteries kept herbals, books listing plants used to either enhance or suppress desire. Mugwort, aniseed, and wild carrot were believed to have cooling properties, while fennel and basil were considered suspiciously spicy. One guide actually recommended bathing with rosemary and speaking only in Latin for a week to curb temptations. We don't know if it worked, but it sounds like a strange spa retreat. Meanwhile, married couples would occasionally seek advice from parish priests, which led to some incredibly awkward confessions. Imagine sitting in a stone booth, whispering through a screen, trying to describe what just happened with your spouse, using only theological terms and barnyard metaphors. Scholars still argue whether medieval people had a more repressed or more practical view of sex. Some suggest that, outside the church's reach, people were quite open, especially in rural villages, where privacy was scarce, and everyone just kind of accepted that married folks did what married folks did. Others argue that fear of sin was deeply internalized, and even innocent affection could lead to guilt. One fascinating document, a penitential guide for confessors, listed penalties for various sins, including kissing during Lent, mild scolding, making jokes in bed, moderate concern, and imagining your neighbor while cuddling your spouse. Go say 10 psalms and think about sheep instead. Clearly, someone had been keeping track. Illustrated manuscripts sometimes betray a cheekier reality. Hidden in the margins of otherwise serious texts are doodles, rabbits kissing, people mooning each other, even a monk chasing a nun with a very exaggerated loaf of bread. Historians have long debated whether these were satirical, symbolic, or just bored scribes letting loose. You kind of hope it's the last one. And then there were the guides. Not official ones, of course, but scattered across Europe were folk texts and whispered advice columns in the form of poems or proverbs. These weren't exactly Kama Sutra material, but they did include such gems as "Take care with beeswax, for it burns when misused," and "The south-facing bed is for fruitful nights," which is either romantic or a warning about sunburn. Communication within marriage varied wildly. Some couples spoke frankly. Others relied on gestures, glances, or a well-timed cabbage thrown at the doorframe. Emotional intimacy wasn't always discussed aloud, but it showed up in small gestures. An extra blanket shared on a cold night, a new comb carved as a surprise, or simply letting your spouse take the warm side of the fire without complaint. Privacy was rare. Most peasants lived in single-room homes with kids, animals, and neighbors nearby. Curtains might separate sleeping areas, but not sound. So couples often developed what historians call covert rhythms, quiet signals, familiar patterns, timing things for when the pigs were squealing or a storm masked the creaking bed frame. Among wealthier folks, there were more layers, both in bedding and in rules. Nobles were expected to produce heirs, quickly. Failure to do so could lead to annulment, scandal, or an extremely uncomfortable conversation with the bishop. Royal marriages, in particular, were closely watched. In some cases, literal witnesses were present during the couple's first night, with candles and a checklist. The medieval version of Yelp, but with more sighing. Yet affection still managed to bloom. Letters between long-married spouses reveal tenderness. Phrases like, "the comfort of your voice," or "may your warmth keep the chill from me." One night, writing from a siege camp, sent his wife a sketch of his hand holding hers, which was oddly poetic considering he'd just written about throwing boiling oil on a ladder. And then there's the communal wisdom, the aunties and uncles who always had advice. Eat parsnips if you want boys. Don't kiss near an open window, it invites spirits. If you dream of rain, someone in your village is thinking impure thoughts. These folk beliefs weren't written down much, but they shaped how people approached intimacy. with awe, curiosity, and the occasional cabbage-based superstition. Ultimately, sex in the medieval world was layered, sacred, practical, awkward, hilarious, regulated, and, above all, human. People made mistakes. They blushed. They whispered. They worried about timing and technique, and whether that mole on their thigh meant anything. In other words, not that different from today. So picture this: a low fire glowing in a hearth, a couple lying side by side, feet poking out from a wool blanket. One snores gently, the other stares at the rafters, wondering whether sheep really do dream. Outside, the wind rustles the thatch, and somewhere, a chicken sighs. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and for many, it was enough. You wake up to the sound of dripping rain and someone arguing with a goose. It's morning in your modest, slightly leaning cottage, and your spouse is already out of bed, muttering about the firewood being damp again. You stretch, bones protesting like old church doors, and consider the day ahead, fetching water, checking the roof, pretending not to hear your neighbor's increasingly detailed love poetry to his cows. Married life continues. It's not an endless honeymoon, but a series of shared challenges, some involving weather, some involving laundry, and some involving your youngest child insisting that the dog is now the bishop. You take it in stride. Despite all the regulations, sermons, and whispered warnings, medieval people still found ways to be close. Love letters, carvings in beams, tokens exchanged during market trips. A worn ribbon, a borrowed cloak, not grand gestures, but real ones. The kind that happen when life is hard and quiet moments are gold. Many households had shared beds, not just between spouses, but sometimes with children, apprentices, or the occasional wandering relative who just needed a place for a few nights and stayed until harvest. Intimacy had to find its moments between snoring, creaking, and someone sneezing directly into the rafters. And sometimes those moments weren't physical. They were in small kindnesses. Extra bread left for a spouse working late, shoes mended without asking, a joke told over a bowl of soup that actually makes you laugh even though you're tired and your nose is cold. Sexual norms evolved gradually. Over time, the church's grip loosened in some places, especially as towns grew and more people gained access to different ideas through books, travelers, or rebellious nuns with good handwriting. In the later Middle Ages, you start seeing more songs, plays, and poems with romantic themes. Some were funny, some were bawdy, and some were sweet enough to make you feel like maybe humanity wasn't doomed after all. One particularly cheeky French poem tells of a woman who outwits her suitor by locking him in a chicken coop overnight. It ends with a moral about virtue, but mostly it's about feathers and embarrassment. Another play features a couple trying to sneak into bed without waking the baby, only to be interrupted by a talking goat. Drama, comedy, and barnyard chaos. Medieval love in a nutshell. Even legal records contain glimpses of affection. One court case involves a husband suing a neighbor for tempting his wife with gingerbread and songs. Another has a woman defending her husband's honor by throwing a turnip at a knight. Devotion, apparently, is root vegetable shaped. And while most of what survives was written by men, clergy, scribes, scholars, there are occasional glimpses of women's voices. A merchant's wife in Italy writes that her husband's letters make the nights shorter and the blankets warmer. A nun in Flanders writes to her former fiancé that even the silence between us was sweet. Whether romantic or platonic, these words reveal emotional lives that were vivid and complex. Still, not every relationship was ideal. Some were strained, forced, or simply unkind. But even in those cases, people sought guidance. Some from clerics, some from midwives, some from that one neighbor who always seemed to know everything and kept a ferret in her apron for dramatic effect. It's easy to imagine the medieval world as joyless, but joy persisted. Sometimes in stolen glances, sometimes in a dance at a feast, sometimes in making silly faces with your partner while pretending not to hear the priest go on about restraint. As for what people actually thought was acceptable or normal, well, that's tricky. Manuals existed, yes. Confessors had checklists, but the reality was far messier, shaped by culture, class, geography, and human weirdness. What was scandalous in Paris might have been shrugged at in a Hungarian village. Historians still argue whether regional traditions mattered more than church doctrine. But let's zoom out for a moment. You're lying in bed again, this time much later in life. Your joints ache. Your roof finally stopped leaking. You and your spouse have weathered harvests, lean winters, and that one year the cows all got mysterious hiccups. And through it all, there was a rhythm, a familiarity, a quiet love, written not in poems but in daily bread, in warming hands, in knowing when to say nothing at all. The children are grown, the chickens are quieter, the cottage hasn't collapsed, which is frankly a miracle. And in the stillness of another evening, you reach across the bed. The straw is pokier than usual. The wind hums through the shutters. You both laugh at nothing, just because. And maybe, just maybe, you realize that medieval love wasn't about passion or poetry or rules. It was about staying, through chores, through silence, through years, the kind of intimacy built slowly, like a fire coaxed from damp wood. Not flashy, but warm. Now, as the candle flickers lower and the fire settles into a soft orange sigh, you feel the hush of night settle around your shoulders like a woolen cloak. The world outside, so full of rain, chores, and quietly judgmental geese, fades into the background, replaced by the quiet creak of memory and the steady rhythm of breath beside you. The bed is small, the blankets uneven, but the room is yours. The moments are yours. A lifetime made not of grand romance, but of shared socks and simmering soup. A love that didn't need words to be felt, just the quiet trust of being there, night after night, year after year. Outside, the wind carries old lullabies across the thatch. A rooster mutters in its sleep. Somewhere, someone drops a bucket, and no one rushes to fix it. You lie still, body softening into the mattress, and feel the weight of centuries lifting. The worries, the rules, the awkward confessions, they're all behind you now. Just breath, warmth, rest. Let the images drift through your mind like parchment pages fluttering in a breeze. Flickering torchlight, a shared smile in a garden, bread baked in silence and eaten in peace. Let them fade like footprints in fresh snow. Sleep is near now.
The fire crackles low. The night grows deeper. And so another story finds its breath. We're gently tiptoeing into the divine pasturelands of Greek mythology. Where jealousy wears a crown, cows are surprisingly central to divine politics, and ancient weddings involved more livestock than cake. We're slipping into the celestial sandals of Hera, queen of the gods, and her extremely complicated feelings about cows. Yes, those big-eyed, grass-chewing, mooing marvels that somehow became sacred symbols and passive-aggressive revenge objects. You're about to wander through olive groves, peek into golden temples, and maybe, just maybe, learn how a cow ended up as someone's punishment and someone else's compliment. You probably won't survive this mythic drama unless you enjoy emotional whiplash from a goddess who once turned a woman into a heifer and still wanted to be worshipped with dairy offerings. You first meet Hera not in a bolt of lightning or thunderous rage, but quietly, beneath a sacred willow, somewhere on the soft hills of Samos. She's not yet the queen of Olympus. She's just Hera, young, divine, oddly fond of birds.
You're standing in a grove that smells of crushed thyme and sea wind. It's peaceful, except for the occasional goat bleating dramatically in the distance. According to the older poets, Hera is raised by the titans Oceanus and Tethys, surrounded by nymphs and fig trees. No drama yet, just the eerie calm before the cosmic soap opera. You brush your hand against the bark of an ancient olive tree, which allegedly sprang up the day she was born. It feels significant, or just dry. Now, fast forward past the titans, the world building, and Zeus's baffling dating strategies. It's wedding time. Hera and Zeus are about to tie the celestial knot. You'd think such a union would come with celestial fanfare and golden confetti, but mostly it comes with a golden cow skin. Yes, Hera receives a sacred golden bed made of cowhide as a wedding gift, which, if nothing else, sets the tone. Even divine weddings are a bit weird. The ceremony itself allegedly takes place in the Garden of the Hesperides, where the apples are gold and probably not very tasty. Hera is radiant in robes of saffron and teal. Zeus is trying to look casual, as if he didn't just transform into a cuckoo bird to win her over. You sip from a clay cup of watered wine and pretend this all makes sense. The garden is filled with divine guests, minor deities, muses tuning their lyres, and a satyr who's already tipsy and trying to dance with a bush. It's a wedding, sure, but it's also a merger of divine domains, of sky and earth, thunder and home.
That sacred cowskin? It gets turned into a sort of divine duvet, a wedding bed covering that becomes an eternal symbol of their union. From this point on, cows become intimately tied with Hera's identity. She's now called Boopis, cow-eyed, which in ancient Greek is actually a compliment. Large, serene eyes, regal, gentle, definitely not mooing. You begin to notice cows everywhere, painted on temple friezes, etched into bronze offerings, embroidered into robes. It's not subtle. Hera is gently but firmly branding her vibe. Historians still argue whether this cow symbolism was originally sacred or sarcastic. Was it reverence or a subtle jab from Zeus's PR team? Hard to say. But the cow sticks, and not just symbolically. Hera's temples often kept actual cows, sometimes dozens of them, tended by priestesses who probably didn't sign up for divine bovine management. By now, you're wandering through the city of Argos, one of Hera's cult centers. The people here absolutely adore her, which is helpful because she's not exactly warm and fuzzy. Her statues depict her with a crown, a scepter, and occasionally a peacock, because subtlety is for mortals. You pass a votive offering left at one of her shrines, a tiny ceramic cow placed carefully on a stone slab. It's been there for centuries. Maybe it was meant to honor her. Maybe someone just didn't have a better gift idea. The paradox is already forming. Hera is both nurturing and wrathful, regal and spiteful. She's the goddess of marriage, but also the goddess who makes marriage look exhausting. She's the patron of fidelity, yet constantly reacting to Zeus's infidelities, like a divine soap opera extra who's been handed a script she didn't ask for. Still, the cows remain, through all the storms, the jealousy, the dramatic metamorphoses of other women into plants and animals. The cows never leave her story. They're there in her titles, in her rituals, in the way people pray to her for stable homes and mild-tempered spouses, while eyeing the herd in the temple courtyard. As the sun sets over Argos and the olive trees cast long, sleepy shadows, you begin to realize something. Hera's relationship with cows isn't just symbolism, it's branding, it's identity. It's the divine equivalent of saying, "This is who I am, even if my husband keeps turning into swans and abducting interns." You sit on a low stone wall, watching temple acolytes brush the cows and prepare votive bread for tomorrow's festival. It smells of thyme, barley, and slightly scorched hope.
And somewhere, in the stillness, Hera's cow-eyed gaze lingers, not angry, not smug, just watching. There's a breeze drifting over the hills of Argos tonight, carrying the scent of crushed laurel and distant olive oil fires. And you're still thinking about those cows. Because here's the twist. While Hera is deeply associated with them, she also weaponizes them in ways that feel personal. Affection and punishment, sacred animal and insult, all mooing in the same divine breath. Let's take a little walk to the edge of myth, where stories get foggier and cows get oddly symbolic. You find yourself beside a sun-drenched field, golden with early summer. And in this field, chewing placidly next to a fig tree, is Io. Io, if you're unfamiliar, is one of Zeus's many romantic diversions. A mortal priestess of Hera, actually. That's the first problem. The second is that Zeus takes a liking to her. The third, he transforms her into a cow. For safety, allegedly, which is the mythological equivalent of hiding your browser history by turning it into a goat. You stand behind the fig tree as Hera arrives. She's not shouting, she doesn't need to. She simply glides up, eyes serene, voice like silk that could slice a tomato. She looks at the cow that is Io and, with perfect composure, asks Zeus where he got it. A gift, he says, for her, which is worse somehow. She takes it, of course, and assigns Argus, the 100-eyed guardian, to watch over Io, which sounds protective, until you realize it's essentially a divine ankle monitor. Hera doesn't need to scream, she has logistics. Historians still argue whether this part of the myth is meant to show Hera's cruelty or her cleverness. Did she punish Io out of jealousy, or was she reclaiming power in the only way the myth allowed her to? Either way, poor Io spends a while mooing across various ancient landscapes, stung by a gadfly Hera sends just to keep her moving. Nothing says passive-aggressive revenge like an immortal insect. You follow Io's path in your mind, through Boeotia, across the Bosporus, into Egypt, where she's eventually turned human again and becomes worshipped as a goddess. As you walk, a small brown cow trots past, bells jingling. She's real, possibly, or maybe just myth, wrapped in barley-scented fog. Back at the temple, you overhear a priest muttering about Hera's cow festival, the Heraya. It's a celebration, but also a statement. Young women run races in her honor, dressed in tunics cut above the knee, scandalous with their hair unbound. It's symbolic of a transition, maiden to wife, girl to grown. And also, it's Hera's moment to say, I may not throw thunderbolts, but I run this domain.
The Heraya is loud and festive, but structured. You watch as the girls stretch beside the racetrack, their bare feet pale against the dusty ground. There's music, pipes and lyres, and the sharp scent of rosemary from garlands worn by the spectators. No cows today, but they're still in the background, carved into statues, painted onto urns, looming quietly in symbolism. By now, you've noticed the contradiction. Hera is supposed to be a figure of stability, marriage, order, fidelity, but the stories surrounding her are a rotating carousel of chaos, betrayal, and divine grudges. And through it all, the cow remains. Sacred, watchful, chewing maybe, but always present. You step into one of her lesser-known sanctuaries, tucked in the countryside near Plataea. It's quiet here, no grand statues, just a weathered altar and the outline of what was once a wooden idol. Long gone now, returned to earth. You sit on a stone and imagine the ancient rituals, bread offerings, milk poured on the ground, quiet prayers for peace in the household, patience in the marriage, fewer gadflies in the bedroom. Quirky side note, some ancient sources describe priestesses of Hera as keeping cows that were believed to predict outcomes. Yes, prophetic cattle. Imagine staring into a cow's glossy brown eyes and asking whether your husband will finally fix the roof. Moo for yes. Of course,
The divine politics don't stop at bovines. Hera also has her symbols, peacocks, lilies, pomegranates, but none of them quite land like the cow. It's simple, it's earthy. It doesn't fly or sting or sparkle. It just stands there, massive and oddly majestic. And that might be the point. You wander into a sculpture garden near Corinth, where a series of statues, now headless, thanks to time and weather, once depicted Hera in all her aspects. Matron, wife, avenger. You brush moss off one of the pedestals and find, etched faintly, the image of a cow surrounded by stars, possibly symbolic. Possibly a bored apprentice doodling during a long workday. The cow becomes not just a reflection of Hera, but of how the ancients saw divine femininity. Fertile, powerful, persistent, and just a little vengeful when provoked. And here's the quieter truth that slips between the lines of myth and marble. Hera is not just the scorned wife. She's the divine administrator of justice, family, and cosmic consequences. The cows are part of that. They stand beside her not just as pets or offerings, but as emblems of resilience, quiet strength, and the occasional well-timed stampede. As the night deepens, you lie down.
The sun hasn't quite risen yet, but the air is already warm, humming with the breath of sleeping olive groves and restless cicadas. You're still thinking about that prophetic cow, not because you believe it, though, honestly, who are you to argue with moo-shaped wisdom, but because the entire mythic ecosystem around Hera seems to operate on symbolism so thick you could spread it on barley bread. You walk slowly now, following a dirt path lined with wild thyme and fig leaves toward another layer of Hera's story, one where cows fade just slightly into the background, replaced by other forms of divine bookkeeping. Marriage, loyalty, revenge, and bureaucracy. Divine, emotional, deeply personal bureaucracy. You arrive at Hera's grandest temple, the Heraion of Samos. It's enormous, even by ancient standards. The columns stretch skyward like tree trunks carved by stern gods with a fondness for geometry. Inside, the cool stone smells faintly of beeswax and incense, and it's here that the high priestesses track offerings with the care of accountants. Every amphora of oil, every strand of dyed wool, every cow, yes, still cows, recorded, blessed, and tagged with divine paperwork. This is the part where you realize Hera isn't just the queen of Olympus, she's its chief administrator. If Zeus is the lightning bolt, she's the insurance policy. While he's off seducing nymphs disguised as golden showers or, bizarrely, swans, Hera is managing the spiritual calendar and probably asking someone why the temple pantry is mysteriously out of olives again. You overhear a debate among scribes, papyrus rustling like dry leaves. They're arguing over the date of an upcoming ritual, a feast in Hera's honor meant to cleanse households of bad luck, misfortune, and particularly loud children. Historians still argue whether this ritual had political purposes. Was it genuinely sacred or also a subtle way to reaffirm control in communities constantly testing divine patience? You duck out of the temple and into a small side garden, lemons and laurels growing around an ancient well. And in that quiet, the myths change tone. The volume drops, the shadows lengthen, and we start to hear stories where Hera's heart becomes more visible. Less rage, more sorrow, less thunderous queen, more celestial woman stuck with the worst husband in mythology. Take Semele, for example, a mortal woman loved by Zeus. And because this is Greek mythology, loved means doomed. Hera, understandably displeased, disguises herself as an old woman and sows doubt in Semele's mind. Why, she asks, won't Zeus show you his true form? Doesn't he trust you? So Semele, seeking proof,
asks Zeus to reveal himself in full divine glory. He tries to refuse, but, tragic loophole, he's already sworn on the river Styx, so he does it.
And Hera? Hera just walks away, not smiling, not smug, just precise, as if saying, this is what happens when you marry the head of HR and cheat during performance reviews. The gods operate on different rules. But you can't help wondering, what's myth and what's metaphor? Was Hera's wrath really about jealousy, or was it the only kind of agency allowed to her in stories written by men who found powerful women inconvenient? By now, you're sitting near a quiet stream, the sound of running water hiding the creak of nearby cartwheels. A farmer passes, leading 2 cows. You nod politely, though the cows ignore you entirely. Typical. The cows, in their blank, chewy silence, seem to understand something about Hera you're only beginning to grasp. That all her symbols, cows, peacocks, pomegranates, aren't just divine branding. They're code. They tell a longer, quieter story, one of presence, permanence, and maybe just a little bit of control over a chaotic world. Let's talk about peacocks for a moment. Peacocks are technically more her signature bird than cows. Their eyes, the ones on their feathers, are said to come from Argus, the 100-eyed watchman she placed over Io. When Argus was slain, thanks Hermes, Hera honored him by transferring his eyes to the tail of her favorite bird. Because even in mourning, she is efficient. Recycling, symbolism, and aesthetic flourish in one move. You glance up, and lo and behold, a peacock struts past. How it got into this olive grove, we don't know. Possibly divine cameo. Its feathers shimmer like sea glass under starlight, the eyes blinking in iridescent judgment. And here's a peculiar tidbit. In some rural areas of ancient Greece, peasants believed that cows could sense divine disapproval. If a cow refused to give milk, someone somewhere must have offended Hera, possibly by forgetting a wedding vow or putting honey on fish. Hard to say. Back in the village, a wedding is underway. You linger by the fringe of the crowd, pretending to examine some pomegranates on a nearby cart. The bride wears a saffron veil. The groom looks slightly terrified. There's music, pipes and lyres again, and a fair amount of nervous bread eating. A priest blesses the couple in Hera's name, invoking her protection. Not for passion, that's more Aphrodite's domain, but for endurance, for shared seasons, for not killing each other over whose turn it is to sweep the hearth. The cows are there too, in the background, grazing near the edge of the field. Not part of the ceremony, but somehow deeply involved. Hera's presence is like that. Quiet, constant, slightly judgmental, always watching. You take one more walk through the olive trees as dusk thickens around you. The shadows are soft now, stretching like stories half remembered. You think about everything Hera holds. Power, yes, but also patience. Fury, sure, but also memory. Maybe the cows remember too. Maybe that's why they watch us like they do. Not judging, just recording. Centuries of quiet stares and unspoken warnings. A breeze rustles the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a peacock calls. The night stretches longer now, heavy with the scent of time and warm dust. And the stars above start to look like they've heard all these stories before. You sit under a twisted olive tree, and while the cows may be asleep, Hera is still wide awake. Spinning plans, weighing debts, keeping track of who owes her what and who's overdue on a divine apology.
And as you lean back against the trunk, you realize we haven't even touched on her most infamous rivalry yet. That's right, the one. The Apple of Discord one. The origin of a war so long and dramatic that it inspired centuries of poets, painters, and board game designers. The Judgment of Paris. Let's set the scene. You're not in Greece anymore, but on the slopes of Mount Ida, overlooking the shadowy plains of Troy. There's a wedding happening of Peleus and Thetis, and Hera's been invited. Which is great, except Eris, goddess of discord, has not, which is less great. So, like any uninvited guest with a grudge and a flair for drama, Eris tosses a golden apple into the festivities, inscribed with 3 extremely cursed words: to the fairest. Chaos ensues. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claim it. No one wants to make a decision, Zeus especially, who backs away like a man who's just remembered a sudden appointment with absolutely anywhere else. Enter Paris, a shepherd prince with good hair and the attention span of a sea cucumber. He's chosen to judge. Each goddess bribes him. Hera offers power, kingship over all of Asia. Athena offers wisdom and military glory. Aphrodite offers love. And by love, we of course mean Helen of Sparta, which is shorthand for 10-year war and a wooden horse situation. Paris picks Aphrodite, Hera loses. And while she doesn't storm off, she never forgets. The Trojan War becomes, in some ways, her revenge campaign. She throws her divine weight behind the Greeks, gets Poseidon to do some flooding, and generally makes things very difficult for Troy. Historians still argue whether Hera's fury is portrayed as personal vendetta or moral protest against injustice, but either way, it's a grudge that spans generations. Back under the olive tree, you smile slightly. Because honestly, Hera plays the long game, not in tantrums, but in strategies. Not in lightning, but in meticulous divine spreadsheets. She's the goddess of consequences. The queen of, oh, you thought I'd forgotten. And through it all, cows remain a constant. Not directly involved in the Paris affair. No one offered him livestock, which, in hindsight, might have helped. But they're still part of Hera's visual story. You picture her returning from Troy, peacock trailing behind her, greeted by the quiet gaze of a dozen temple cows. No cheers, no fanfare, just cud and approval. You wander again, this time to the island of Delos, where the air tastes like salt and chamomile. There's a small shrine to Hera tucked beside a cliff path. It's worn, almost forgotten, but someone still leaves offerings there. Small pots of honey, feathers, bits of silver ribbon. You light a tiny oil lamp and set it near the altar. Not because you expect anything, but because it feels right. Hera remembers. And maybe she notices who remembers her. Back in town, the Harvest Festival is underway. Torches line the streets, and musicians play songs that haven't changed in 1,000 years. Children carry garlands, and one overly excited goat knocks over a barrel of dates. No one's mad. It's tradition. At the temple steps, women offer prayers to Hera, not just for fertility or marriage, but for strength, fairness, and calm amid chaos. It's easy to forget, under the layers of myth and vengeance, that Hera is also called Hera Telia, goddess of completeness. She doesn't just govern weddings, she blesses their longevity. She's invoked not at the start, but in the hard middle parts when things creak and splinter and need glue made of sheer willpower. You spot another small herd of cows tied near the edge of the celebration. Their hides shine under the torchlight, and they seem wholly unimpressed by everything. One of them looks at you, possibly judging your snack choice, possibly a reincarnated mythic witness. You wave anyway. And now, let's detour briefly into one of Hera's lesser-known titles, Bopis. It literally means cow-eyed, which, depending on your interpretation, is either deeply flattering or deeply confusing. In Homeric poetry, it's meant to be a compliment, denoting wide, majestic, watchful eyes. But in modern ears, Well, cow-eyed isn't exactly billboard material. Still, in ancient Greece, it was shorthand for beauty. Depth, stillness, the ability to see and be seen. The cows, as always, seem unbothered by the comparison. They chew in soft unison, a kind of bovine harmony. You wonder if Hera ever envied that peace, or if she simply claimed it, draped herself in its stillness, and made it sacred. In a dusty field outside Corinth, you witness a midsummer rite to honor Hera's agricultural aspect. The priestess sprinkles barley in a slow circle, then releases 2 white calves into the ring. They don't do anything spectacular, no prophecies, no interpretive dances, but the crowd sighs anyway. It's the gesture that matters. The circle, the continuity, the cows walking the perimeter of myth. You sit on the grass as twilight softens the world. Hera's image flickers through your thoughts now, sometimes regal, sometimes spiteful, often weary, always composed. She is the queen, yes, but she's also the keeper of patterns, the one who notices when things shift, when loyalty falters, when promises fray. And cows, in their slow, observant way, are perfect companions for that kind of goddess. They see everything, they forget nothing, and they never interrupt. The last thing you hear before sleep takes you is the low melodic hum of cowbells in the wind.
By now the stars have shifted their position slightly, inching across the deep indigo sky like slow-moving gossip. You stir from your half-sleep under a fig tree, the air cooler now, scented faintly with the smoke of someone baking flatbread nearby. It's a quiet, crumbly sort of night, perfect for a final walk with Hera and her silent herd of celestial cows. You find yourself back on the Peloponnesian mainland in Argos, one of Hera's oldest strongholds. The ancient city breathes history from every crack in its worn flagstones. You pass a dusty olive press, its stone wheels still warm from the day's work. Farther up the slope sits the Heraion of Argos, once one of the most sacred places in all of Greece. Temple ruins now, but still somehow humming. You walk among the toppled columns, as if visiting the aftermath of a great and complicated conversation. A wind stirs the tall grass, and you imagine Hera's voice in it, not thunderous, but patient, the voice of someone who's watched civilizations rise and fall, and still insists on straightening the corners of the tablecloth. She's not Aphrodite's flotation, nor Athena's clarity, nor Demeter's grief. She's something steadier, something that holds a structure up, long after others have moved on. Here, under Argive skies, the cow emerges again, not as symbol or punishment, but companion, a constant. Hera was said to ride in a chariot drawn by them. Not horses, not lions, not griffins. Cows, animals of the field, of daily life, of quiet, strong presence. There's something humbling about that, something solid, something stubborn. And now we have to talk about Io. Poor Io, a priestess of Hera, seduced by Zeus again, then turned into a cow, yes again, to hide the affair. Hera, not fooled for a second, asks Zeus to gift her the cow. Classic move. And then assigns Argus, her 100-eyed servant, to watch over it. A divine babysitter with a built-in security system. You know what happens next. Hermes puts Argus to sleep. Storytellers love this bit. And slays him. Hera, ever the archivist, collects his many eyes and places them in her peacock's tail. And Io? She's left to wander the earth, hoofed and confused, pursued by a gadfly and mythic consequences. Eventually, after many trials, she's returned to human form and becomes the mother of dynasties. It's the perfect Hera story. Grief, control, symbolism, cosmic spreadsheets, and a visual signature that will outlast empires. And always, always she makes sure that memory survives. Even if it has to be gilded into feathers or painted on temple walls.
You find a quiet spring on the hillside and sit beside it, letting your fingers trail through the water. It's said that some of Hera's earliest cults worshipped her here as a goddess of fertility and rain, long before the Olympian dramas. long before thrones and rivalries and golden apples. Just a presence, just a hum in the earth, just the rhythm of cows returning home at dusk.
There's a fringe myth,
Obscure, whispered in Boeotian dialects, that Hera once disguised herself as a cow to escape a curse, or maybe a bet, or maybe just to get some peace and quiet for once. Historians still argue whether this tale was ever meant seriously, or if it was just a local joke scrawled into a temple wall by a bored initiate. Either way, it's oddly soothing to imagine her in that form, not as queen or fury, but as a soft-eyed creature in a quiet field, chewing slowly, pretending not to care. Back in the village, the hearth fires are dimming. You pass a kitchen window and see a woman braiding dough into a crescent shape. She mutters a blessing to Hera, not as an epic invocation, but as habit, as a murmur, like brushing away crumbs. And that's what Hera becomes, in the end. A pattern in the domestic landscape, a rhythm in the noise. She's there when someone ties a wedding ribbon. She's there when someone counts calves at sunrise. She's even there when someone sighs at a stubborn husband and rolls her eyes toward the heavens. One last cow wanders past. Its bell rings softly. You smile. Maybe you're beginning to understand her now. Not the stories, but the shape behind them. Not the wrath, but the watchfulness. Hera isn't trying to be loved. She's making sure things don't fall apart. And somehow, that's the most romantic thing of all. You walk back to your bedroll under the fig tree, curl your knees against the chill, and feel the night tuck itself gently around you.
Let not thy eyes close just yet.
For there is one more tale, slow and strange, waiting in the dark. We are slipping quietly behind the threadbare curtain of an Elizabethan playhouse, where the air smells of damp timber, dried sweat, and overly ambitious makeup attempts using crushed berries. You're not the star. You're barely a supporting role. In fact, you may be understudy to a goat. Still, you've got a script in your trembling hands and a pair of breeches that technically belong to 3 other people before you. It's showtime, and your tights are still damp. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts before sunrise, in a communal lodging space that generously calls itself a room, but feels more like a cupboard with ambition. You're one of 12 actors crammed into it, each of you sprawled on straw mats, snoring, drooling, and occasionally muttering lines from the Spanish tragedy in your sleep. The only privacy you get is when someone turns over, and the blanket shifts enough to block your view of everyone else's toes. The first performance isn't until mid-morning, but backstage panic begins with the rising sun, or more precisely with someone yelling, "Who has my hose?" which in this context refers to legwear and not a garden tool. Though you'd honestly prefer the garden tool. At least then you'd have something that didn't itch. Your undergarments, or what passes for them, aren't strictly your own. They are company property, washed, occasionally, possibly by rain, possibly never. Historians still argue whether Elizabethan acting troupes had scheduled laundry days, or simply waited until garments could walk off on their own. The evidence leans toward the latter. As you stretch and yawn, you realize with a sinking feeling that the only available doublet smells suspiciously of onions. You try not to think about how or why that happened. Meanwhile, your fellow actors are hopping around on one foot, trading shirts like drunken, bartering monks. There's no system. There's just shouting and sniffing, and every so often, someone discovering a hidden prop dagger in a sleeve. You're lucky if your breeches are only mildly damp. You're luckier if they're not embroidered with initials that clearly don't match your own. But at this point, modesty is as extinct as a warm bath. Your makeup consists of a smear of charcoal, a dab of animal fat, and blind optimism. Rouge, if available, is made of crushed roses, or if roses aren't available, beets. If beets aren't available, you just pinch your cheeks and hope for the best. And then there's the lice. Oh, the lice. Costume trunks double as breeding grounds. You try not to think about it. Everyone itches. Everyone pretends they're not itching. It's a very elegant, very scratchy dance. In theory, each actor has one costume. In reality, each actor has 1/3 of a costume and 2/3 of a problem.
Sometimes you end up wearing the same shirt from the day before because someone else, probably Simon, swiped the clean one while you were rehearsing your death monologue. Again. You try to adapt. You learn to sew quickly. You stitch ripped seams while muttering sonnets. You become unreasonably attached to a certain pair of socks because they don't slide down your calves when you leap dramatically. You even name them, Bernard and Agnes. Backstage, your personal space is marked only by the pile of belongings you can sit on without upsetting a fellow actor. Props are mixed in with discarded tights, turkey bones from last night's dinner, and half-memorized cue cards. At one point, you discover your dagger has been replaced by a chicken leg. You decide not to question it. There's a certain poetry to this chaos, a strange rhythm, an understanding that everyone's dignity is frayed, everyone's neckline is slightly off, and if someone's sleeves are swapped during the performance, well, so be it. That's the theater. Still, there's rivalry. Silent, simmering rivalry. Over who gets the least torn jerkin. Over who smells the least like turnips. Over who can claim the one pair of hose without visible holes. You learn to wake up early. You learn to hide things. You learn to say, "These tights are cursed," convincingly enough that no one else dares to touch them. You also learn quite quickly not to wash your clothes in the Thames. The water gives them a smell, an attitude, a mild but persistent growl. One actor tried it once. He's now known as Eel Shirt. Despite everything, the shed socks, the missing cuffs, the underpants so communal, they might as well be passed around with the morning biscuits, there's a strange camaraderie. A sense that if you're all going down in a blaze of linen and beet juice blush, at least you're going together.
Costume mix-ups are constant. Once, you went on stage in a jester's leggings and a bishop's collar. No one noticed. The audience, made up mostly of drunk apprentices and impatient merchants, wasn't here for historical accuracy. They were here for sword fights and maybe someone falling off the stage.
In truth, no one remembers whose clothes are whose. You suspect some of the doublets have been in rotation since Henry VIII, or possibly since wool was invented. You wear what fits. You pretend it was intentional. You hope the audience is too distracted by the swordplay to notice the suspicious cabbage patch pattern on your breeches. And when you finally get fully dressed, even if fully involves an exposed elbow and a suspicious buckle, you take a deep breath and say, "Ready," even if you're not. Even if Bernard the sock is slipping again, because the show must go on. Whether or not your underwear is technically yours.
You don't get a dressing room. What you get is a shadowy corner behind the stage, wedged between a barrel of leftover props and a suspiciously moldy curtain that smells of lavender and mildew. You try to stretch, to warm up your voice, but every sound you make echoes into someone else's soliloquy. It's like trying to rehearse Hamlet while someone next to you screams about fish prices in iambic pentameter. You step onto the platform stage, which creaks under your feet like it's holding a grudge. The wood is warped, cracked, and partially eaten by something you suspect was once alive and vengeful. But this is your arena. This is your glory. This is your opportunity to forget that the codpiece you're wearing used to belong to a man named Reginald, and it still bears his initials in flamboyant embroidery. The crowd is restless. The standing pit, cheekily called the yard, is already full of spectators clutching meat pies, tankards, and possibly unresolved personal vendettas. They paid a penny to get in, which, in Elizabethan terms, is just enough to justify booing if they're bored. The better-dressed crowd sits in galleries above, trying not to look like they're judging the pit dwellers, while very much judging the pit dwellers. The very wealthy sit behind a wooden screen. They can't see the stage, but that's not the point. They're there to be seen being seen, not watching, which somehow still counts as culture. And then it begins. Your lines tumble out, rehearsed but rushed as your tongue trips over some newly invented Middle English phrase that sounds like a sneeze with vowels. The play is some hybrid morality tale, classical tragedy, and thinly veiled satire about a corrupt official who, coincidentally, looks suspiciously like a real-life mayor. You don't make eye contact with him, mostly because he's glaring. In theory, the actors should stay in character. In practice, you dodge tomatoes, improvise when your co-star forgets half a scene, and pause mid-monologue because a goose wanders on stage. The goose gets more applause than you. You pretend not to mind. You lean into the moment. You become the role, even if the role is disheveled messenger number 2, who has exactly 3 lines and one of them is, alas. Still, there's magic. When the audience gasps, you feel it in your ribs. When they laugh, you ride the sound like a wave. When they throw things, you duck. Behind the scenes, the chaos continues. Someone has lost a sword. Another actor just realized his mustache is upside down, and the boy playing the queen can't stop sneezing because of the feather ruff. You try not to laugh. You fail.
You shuffle off stage and immediately start changing. There's no time to relax. There's another role, another outfit, another set of borrowed socks to wrangle onto your tired legs. You become someone else entirely. A priest, a pirate, a surprisingly sarcastic ghost. And yes, you share the costumes. You swap shirts mid-line, you adjust your co-star's collar while still delivering your lines. Once you help someone put on a belt with your teeth. The audience thought it was part of the act. You learn to be efficient. You learn to layer costumes in the order of your roles. You wear the hat of a friar over the coif of a widow, over the helmet of a doomed soldier. You are an Elizabethan onion of tragic expression. And let's not forget the props. There are exactly 5 functional swords, 2 masks, a fake severed hand made of mutton bone and candle wax, and 1 extremely fragile goblet. You all fight over the goblet because it's the only prop that doesn't smell like feet. Occasionally, props break. Once, someone used the goblet as a drum. Once, a dagger got stuck in the floor. Once, an actor forgot to bring the letter that drives the entire plot. So he mimed reading an imaginary scroll with such intensity that the audience just went with it. Everything is held together with spit, string, and sheer desperation. And when the play ends, when the curtain falls, or rather when someone manually pulls a slightly stained bedsheet across the back of the stage, you bow. You bow deeply. You bow like the fate of your supper depends on it, because it might. The audience claps, or doesn't, or throws something mildly soft. You pick up whatever's edible and count it as a win. Then comes the strike. Not a strike for better conditions, heavens no. A strike as in strike the stage, where you and your fellow actors haul benches, props, and questionable banners back into the backstage chaos. You try not to lose your shoes in the process. Dinner is whatever hasn't been stepped on. A shared pie, a boiled turnip, a chunk of bread traded for your last clean handkerchief. You eat with your fingers, sitting on the edge of the stage, still in half costume, trying to ignore the splinter poking your thigh. You clean the costumes as best you can, which is to say you shake them out and hope no beetles fall out. If you're lucky, you find a stray coin in a pocket. If you're really lucky, it's not someone else's. You hang your garments in the corner, damp, rumpled, and very much alive with the collective smell of 12 anxious performers and 3 days of continuous theater. You pat them like old friends. You sigh. You scratch. And then it's time to sleep again, curled beneath a threadbare cloak, with someone's elbow in your side and someone else's foot near your face. You mumble lines in your sleep. So does everyone else. You dream in iambic pentameter. You wake up to someone yelling about missing hose. Again. You wake up to a sound that is either someone gargling or trying to hit a high note. It's Simon, rehearsing again. He always rehearses early. He says it sharpens the tongue. You suspect it's just to secure the warmest spot near the fire before anyone else crawls out of their pile of cloaks. Your joints ache. There's straw in your hair. One of your socks has migrated to someone else's foot. You think it's Bernard. Agnes is missing. You try not to panic. Outside, the weather is performing its own little drama. Rain drums on the tiled roof like an impatient percussionist. The courtyard is turning into a sea of sludge, and the pigeons perched along the eaves look genuinely offended by it all. You stand, stretch, and immediately regret stretching.
Every muscle protests. Your back mutinies. Your legs suggest retirement, but you push through. Because today is another day of shared undergarments and vaguely remembered cues. Breakfast is porridge. The consistency is debatable. It tastes of oats in defeat. Someone added dried apples. Someone else added mustard by mistake or experiment. You eat it anyway. You're not proud, just hungry. After breakfast, the troupe gathers for rehearsal. Today's play is The Wily Wife, a comedy involving 3 wigs, 2 misdelivered letters, and 1 unfortunate misunderstanding involving sheep. You play the sheep. It's a non-speaking role, unless you count bleeding. Rehearsal is chaotic. The director, if you can call him that, is a man named Dunstable, who speaks only in grunts and gestures, like a bear trying to direct traffic. He waves a stick, yells more passion, and then immediately falls asleep on a bench. The actors mill about, trying to remember blocking, while also trying to remember whether that suspicious stain on the stage is wax or stew, possibly both. Someone trips over a prop stool and dramatically claims injury. You clap. It's the best performance you've seen all week. Costume swaps continue. Today, the red velvet doublet is missing. It was last seen on Reginald, who may or may not have traded it for a pie. You search the costume trunk, pulling out lace collars, moth-nibbled cloaks, and 1 oddly aggressive pair of breeches. You settle on a tunic that smells like cloves. It's a win. And then, disaster. Your hose, Agnes's replacement, splits dramatically as you attempt to crouch. The room goes silent. Someone gasps. Someone else says, "Again." You sigh. You sew. You carry on.
Rehearsals take most of the day. They shouldn't, but they do. Partly because people forget their lines. Mostly because they argue about them. Historians still argue whether Elizabethan actors strictly followed scripts or just made it up as they went along. Judging by today, you're leaning toward bold improvisation with extra flailing. By mid-afternoon, there's a break. Everyone collapses in various corners like dramatic laundry strewn across the boards. You try to nap, using a rolled-up jerkin as a pillow. It doesn't work. You're woken up by a lute string snapping. The lute was not being played. Then comes the pre-show ritual. Everyone gathers around Crispin, the costume master, who is attempting to reattach a ruff with wax and optimism. You each receive your assigned pieces, most of them frayed, some of them damp, one of them still warm. No one asks why. You're wearing Reginald's old shirt, again. It's big, it's loud, and it has a sewn-in pouch that once held onions. You know this because it still smells like onions. You try to tie a sash around your waist, but the sash resists. It has opinions. It prefers to be elsewhere. You go on anyway. Tonight's audience includes a minor noble and his very bored-looking entourage. The troupe is nervous. Last time a noble attended, someone flubbed a joke and accidentally insulted a bishop. It did not go well. There was talk of exile. There were definitely radishes thrown. But you focus, you breathe, you hit your marks, you bleat convincingly. The audience chuckles. Someone in the pit claps. The noble smirks. It's a triumph. A weird, itchy, slightly too tight triumph. Backstage, spirits are high. Someone found a whole loaf of bread. Someone else swears they saw Agnes under a bench. You toast a good fortune with tepid cider and reheated beans. It's almost like luxury. That night, around the fire, you tell stories, not grand ones, small ones. The time the stage collapsed mid-duel. The time someone forgot they were playing dead and sneezed. The time 2 actors switched roles without warning and no one noticed. You laugh, you itch, you scratch. You share everything. Your food, your stories, your costumes, your lice. It's a kind of rough, resilient family, bound not by blood, but by stitching and desperation. Before sleep, you mend your tunic. Again. You tie a knot in your belt to mark it as yours. You tuck Bernard safely under your mat. You make a vow to rescue Agnes. The fire dims, the whispers fade. You curl beneath your borrowed cloak, still dressed in Reginald's second-best shirt, and dream of applause that doesn't involve vegetables.
Morning arrives slowly, dragging its damp breath across your face. You wake up to the unmistakable smell of feet smoke
and ambition. Someone's already stoking the fire with rolled-up scripts from last week's disaster of a romance play. You didn't like that one anyway. Too many metaphors. Not enough sword fights. You begin the day by searching for your left boot. It has once again wandered off during the night, probably worn by someone who claimed it was fairly similar to their own. You find it eventually, hidden under a lute and filled with what you hope is straw. You don't ask questions. Breakfast is yesterday's bread and today's grudges. Reginald is sulking because someone cut holes in his best tights to use as puppet mouths. You try not to get involved, but somehow you're asked to mediate. You solve the conflict by offering to swap his ruined tights for a slice of cheese you've been hiding in your sleeve. Crisis averted. Friendship restored through dairy. The troupe heads out into the streets. Today is a special performance for a merchant guild, one of those slightly pompous, slightly confused groups of wealthy tradesmen who like the idea of theatre, so long as it doesn't challenge anything or take too long. You're told to keep it light, skip the death scenes, and no jokes about shoemakers. Apparently that's a sore spot. The venue is a hall, not quite indoors, not quite outdoors. It has no stage, just a cleared space marked with chalk and hope. The acoustics are, as Simon puts it, beyond tragic. You'll have to shout and hope your voice doesn't crack on verily. Still, the crowd gathers. The merchants arrive in a cloud of perfumed sleeves and hushed commentary. Their apprentices trail behind them, looking terrified of accidentally laughing at the wrong moment. You set up behind a hanging tapestry that smells like damp wool and ambition. The play is The Discreet Husband, which is ironic since it contains no discretion and very few husbands. But it has jokes and mistaken identities and one very long monologue about pickled eels. It's a hit. Your role today is the serving man with a secret, which mostly involves hiding behind things and popping out dramatically. You do it with such flair that one merchant chokes on a fig. You take this as a compliment. Your costume for this role is stitched from 3 other costumes. The sleeves belong to a monk. The collar is suspiciously regal. The trousers, well, no one's quite sure, but they're velvet, and they shimmer when you move. You decide to lean into it. You are now the most fashionable secret keeper in the land.
The performance runs long, mostly because Bernard forgets where to exit and ends up hiding behind a barrel for 15 minutes. You stall by delivering your lines with increasingly large gestures. By the time he emerges, the audience thinks the confusion was deliberate. You take another silent bow. Afterward, you mingle. Merchants love to talk about themselves. One insists you'd make a fine apprentice if you ever leave this theatrical life. You nod politely, while trying not to spill cider down your borrowed tunic. Another asks if the tights are real. You pretend not to hear. Back at the playhouse, you're met with news. A traveling noble has booked a private show. Tonight. 1 hour from now. And it's King Leontes and the Moon Wager. A 5-act tragedy performed so rarely, no one remembers the ending. You look around. Everyone is already panicking. Costumes are ripped from trunks, scripts are half scribbled. Simon insists he knows all the lines. He does not. You draw lots for roles. You get the moon, which involves lying on a table, covered in tinfoil, and whispering ominous advice. You're thrilled. The play begins late. The noble is late. His dog is not. The dog takes a strong dislike to Crispin's wig. The wig loses. When the noble arrives, he sits in silence, surrounded by his household. No one claps. No one blinks. It's like performing for a portrait gallery. You do your best. You glow with moony mystery. You forget one line, but replace it with a cryptic hum. The audience thinks it's symbolism. You go with it. At one point, the scenery collapses. A curtain falls. A sword gets stuck in a chair. It is
Technically, a disaster. But also strangely poetic, the noble finally smiles. After the curtain, or rather, the tablecloth, falls, he claps once. Just once. It echoes like approval carved in marble. Everyone exhales. Later, in the warm afterglow of not being banished, you gather backstage. Someone finds an old jug of ale. Someone else sings a lullaby off-key. You repair your moon costume with gold thread and determination. And someone, no one's sure who, starts telling ghost stories. Not the scary kind, the weird kind. The one about the haunted prop dagger that only disappears on Tuesdays. The one about the ghost of an old actor who critiques performances from the rafters. You listen, half smiling, half asleep. The fire crackles. Your borrowed cloak feels a little less scratchy. Bernard has found a new button. Agnes is still missing, but you believe in her return. You fall asleep, rehearsing lines that no longer make sense.
You fall asleep rehearsing lines that no longer make sense. They float through your dreams, tangled with velvet and footlights. You dream of standing ovations and socks without holes. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. And yes, you'll still be sharing underwear. You're awakened by the soft slap of cold laundry to the face. It's your turn to rinse the shared costume linens in the stream that runs just past the edge of the town, also known as the least glamorous part of show business. You trudge out before sunrise, arms full of tights, ruffs, and at least one suspiciously damp codpiece, trying not to slip on the frost that's turned the path into an accidental ice stage. The stream bubbles with that smug clarity only water can have when it knows you have to put your hands in it. You do, reluctantly. Immediately, your fingers regret everything. You swish fabric, you scrub gently. You lose one sock to the current, possibly forever. It's fine. It wasn't your sock anyway. Back at the playhouse, someone is trying to cook eggs over a candle. Someone else is debating whether soup counts as breakfast. You dry the clothes by hanging them from the beams above the fire, hoping nothing catches. The room now smells like wood smoke, thyme, and damp wool, also known as theater air. Today is a rest day. Technically, it means no public performances. It does not mean rest. There are lines to memorize, props to fix, scripts to copy by hand, because Reginald spilled ink on the master version. He swears it was an accident. No one believes him. Your task is to repaint the backdrop, a majestic forest, which currently looks more like a green blob wearing a hat. You attempt trees. You attempt depth. You fail, but with style. The end result resembles a forest, if the forest had a fever and artistic ambitions. You call it good enough. A knock at the door. It's the wig merchant. He arrives monthly with a suitcase full of matted curls and whisper-thin promises. You trade one prop sword and 2 dried apples for something lightly used that smells of rosewater and pipe smoke. It's probably haunted. You love it. In the corner, Simon is writing a new play. It features a talking donkey who solves crimes. You tell him it's ridiculous. He beams. That's the point, he says. You suspect he's a genius or completely unhinged. Possibly both. The afternoon rolls on. A game of dice begins in the wings, interrupted only when someone knocks over the stage weights and narrowly avoids a concussion. Agnes returns, dusty, triumphant, and carrying someone's missing slipper. You welcome her like a hero.
You practice swordplay in the courtyard. By swordplay, you mean trying not to hit each other with wooden sticks while quoting dramatic lines. It's going well, until Bernard falls into the water barrel. He emerges, drenched and proud. Method acting, he declares. A local priest arrives with a request. Would the troupe be willing to perform a morality play in the church this Sunday? Something about sin, repentance, and the dangers of over-enthusiastic dancing. You nod politely, agree to consider it, and immediately begin drafting a comedy about dancing shoes that possess people. Night falls. The fire is lit. Someone reads aloud from a borrowed book of fables, mispronouncing every third word and inventing the rest. The story ends with a goose marrying a miller. You clap anyway. It was moving. Dinner is roasted turnips and crumbly cheese. Not glamorous, but warm. You pass the plate around, pass the wineskin after, and laugh until your sides hurt. At nothing, at everything. And then it's time for mending again. You stitch a new patch onto your tunic, this time in the shape of a star. Someone compliments it. You say it's a creative choice. You both know it's covering a wine stain. You curl up near the fire, with your cloak around your shoulders, Bernard under one arm, Agnes curled like a tiny judgmental pillow at your feet. The wig you bought earlier is hanging upside down to air out. It looks like it might walk off if given the chance. You think about tomorrow's show. You think about the audience, the cues, the line you always forget in Act 3. You smile. You'll remember it this time, probably. You drift off to sleep as someone hums a lullaby with no words, just soft sounds and softer sighs. The fire crackles low. The stage is quiet, for now. But in your dreams, the curtains rise again. You're center stage. You're wearing socks that match. The crowd roars. It's the life you didn't ask for, but strangely, the life that fits.
They say no story's truly done, only sleeping. Shall we wake another?
We are slipping quietly into a peculiar corner of the 19th century, where empires collapse, generals suck, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a lonely bathtub becomes the most important object on a very isolated rock. Napoleon Bonaparte, who once ruled half of Europe, ends up spending his final days on a faraway island, taking long, hot baths, like a disappointed Roman emperor who forgot how to conquer boredom. The waves crash, the seabirds squawk, and the soap slowly melts in silence. You probably won't survive this, but you might get squeaky clean in the process. You open your eyes to a breeze that smells faintly of sea salt and bitter regret. St. Helena isn't exactly paradise. It's green, sure, in a windswept, will this cloud ever leave kind of way. The island sits isolated in the middle of the South Atlantic, like a forgotten afterthought scribbled into a map. And you, who used to stand beneath the Arc de Triomphe, or well, let's pretend you did, now trudge across damp grass, helping unload crates labeled Imperial Linen and Personal Effects. No crown, no horses, just crates, lots of them. Napoleon doesn't say much when he arrives. He's shorter than you expected, but somehow manages to fill the entire space with the weight of unspoken insults. His boots are muddy, his hat perfectly tilted. He scans the horizon like he's trying to negotiate a new treaty with the weather.
Your job is simple. Follow orders. Mostly small things. Move this, lift that. Don't speak unless spoken to. You're told the emperor needs rest. He's tired, exhausted even. And yet he's already asking for a bath. Not just any bath, mind you. A proper soaking tub, deep, wide, preferably made of metal, preferably French. There is no such thing on St. Helena. This creates a problem. The British governor, whose name is so boring you forget it instantly, scratches his head and mutters about shipping delays. Napoleon waves his hand, as though dismissing an army, and sulks off to his quarters. He will not accept a bucket. He will not settle for sponge baths. He demands a tub, a real tub. So one is ordered. It takes months. When it finally arrives, hauled up from the docks with a team of groaning soldiers, it is glorious.
When it finally arrives, hauled up from the docks with a team of groaning soldiers,
It is glorious. Enamel, curved edges, ornate claw feet. It looks like it should belong in a Parisian salon, not on a wind-whipped volcanic island in the middle of nowhere. Napoleon inspects it silently. Then, with a slow nod, he approves. The daily bath routine begins. Every evening, warm water is lugged in by servants. The emperor soaks for nearly an hour. Sometimes he hums. Sometimes he stares into the distance like he's reliving past battles, or trying to remember if he locked the back gate of the Tuileries Palace. Steam fills the room. The window fogs. And for a moment, everything softens. One guard swears he saw Napoleon wearing a towel on his head like a turban. Another says the emperor gave a rousing speech to the soap dish. You don't believe either story, but the tub becomes a fixture of his new life. The bathtub is his throne now, damp but symbolic. Historians still argue whether these baths were for health, habit, or just an excuse to escape everyone for an hour. Some say it was therapeutic. Others insist it was part of his vanity, a final imperial luxury in a life stripped of ceremony. What's clear is that no one disturbs Napoleon in the bath, except for once, when a goat wandered in. That goat did not return. The days drag. Napoleon gardens. He writes. He complains. He bathes. You fetch towels. The soap runs low, replaced with something handmade that smells vaguely of moss and defeat. The emperor grows rounder, slower. He still wears his uniform, but it fits differently now, like he's playing dress-up in his own life. Sometimes he speaks to you, briefly, about horses, or the price of good bread, or how England is, in fact, an island of shopkeepers with no poetry. You nod. You do not comment on the poetry. You begin to know the tub's schedule better than your own. The sound of water being poured becomes part of the island's rhythm. The gentle thunk of a soap dish, the soft slosh of imperial solitude. And then, Napoleon falls ill. The doctor is vague. The governor is useless. The emperor grows weaker. But still, the baths continue. Until they don't. One day, the tub stays dry. And that's where things begin to unravel.
The next morning, the household is unusually quiet. Even the goat seems hesitant to bleat. You are used to the bustle, servants carrying linens, the clink of water buckets, the occasional imperial complaint about lukewarm water. But today, the tub sits untouched, cold, abandoned. It glints dully in the grey morning light, a once regal relic now slightly crusted with limescale and forgotten ambitions. Napoleon doesn't get up. Or rather, he gets up, but only to sit by the window in a wool blanket that smells faintly of lavender and long-washed metals. He stares out, not at the sea, but at the horizon,
as if trying to see France from there, or possibly just imagining Paris in the steam of a long-lost bath. You're told he won't need help today, so naturally you do what any rational servant does. You clean the bathtub. You scrub it with something gritty and probably volcanic. You whisper an apology for the state of the soap dish. You even arrange the towels in the order he likes them. Slightly damp, then dry, then fancy but unusable. And then, one day, it's just gone. The bathtub disappears. You blink at the empty space like it's some kind of magician's trick. One moment, Napoleon's nightly haven is sitting in the corner with imperial dignity. The next, there's just tile, damp tile, with a single dent where a clawfoot once stood. No one knows where it went, or if they do, they're suddenly too interested in polishing spoons to talk about it. You ask around. The cook shrugs. The laundress claims she thought it was being repaired. The stable boy says he saw a cart heading toward the docks with something tub-shaped under a tarp. The governor insists it was moved for sanitary reasons, though he won't elaborate. Historians still argue whether the disappearance was deliberate or accidental. Was it sold? Stolen? Shipped back to England by a souvenir hunting officer who wanted the weirdest possible family heirloom? Or did someone just forget to label the crate? No one files a report. No one starts a search. It's as though the tub never existed, despite the lingering soap rings and your personal sense of bath-related betrayal. Napoleon doesn't ask about it, or at least not directly. But he grows quieter, sicker. The blanket spends more time around his shoulders than over his lap, and the room feels colder. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the kind that comes from knowing a part of your routine has slipped away forever.
Meanwhile, you start noticing a strange tension among the staff. Conversations pause when you walk in. Someone begins labeling buckets with names like "not for soup" and "do not sit in." There's a lot of crate counting and clipboard shuffling. One night, you overhear a whispered conversation about the bathtub manifest, another about the Lisbon crate mix-up. You're not supposed to be listening, so you shuffle past with the sort of exaggerated nonchalance perfected only by underpaid servants and underqualified spies. Soon, rumors take over. The tub, someone says, was shipped accidentally with Napoleon's hats and is now decorating a bishop's garden. Another version insists it never left the island. It's buried somewhere near the vegetable patch, covered with dirt and cabbage guilt. One particularly unhelpful theory posits that the tub was always symbolic and never real. Just a metaphorical basin representing imperial decline. That theory is quickly dismissed by the scullery maid who had to scrub it. Time passes. Napoleon weakens. He dies. The end is unremarkable, quiet. The tub is never mentioned in the official papers. No line in the death inventory. No note in the dispatches. Just the final breath of an emperor and a suspiciously empty corner of the room. Years later, when you've left the island and taken up chicken farming somewhere mercifully without emperors, someone writes to you. A strange letter, from a stranger still. They say they're researching Napoleonic relics and would like to confirm rumors of a metallic soaking vessel once favored by the emperor. You write back, simply, it existed. And then it didn't. The stranger doesn't reply. But the bathtub legend begins. It crops up in antique shops, dealers claiming to have Napoleon's last tub. It shows up in estate sales, marked as French military wash basin, circa 1815. At one point, a porcelain fixture at a country manor is labeled Bonaparte's basin until someone realizes it's actually just an unusually large soup tureen. Collectors become obsessed. Museums speculate. At least 2 documentary crews visit St. Helena to film moody shots of clawfoot replacements and reenactments of imperial sponging. There's even a theory that Napoleon never really died, but faked his death and escaped in the bathtub. That one's usually shared by people wearing lots of buttons and suspiciously little logic. You keep quiet, but sometimes when the wind blows just right, you swear you can still hear the echo of sloshing water and the faint hum of a Frenchman soaking away his exile.
The years drift on like a sleepy canal barge, and the mystery of the missing bathtub only deepens. You don't talk about it much anymore. No one really does, but somehow it lingers, like a faint soap scent in a dusty corner, or a damp ring left on a flagstone floor by something heavy and mildly regal. You've taken to walking most mornings.
usually before the others rise. It's quiet then. St. Helena is still wrapped in fog and salt, the air cool with sea spray and distant rumors. One morning, you pause near the old goat path, the one that leads down toward the cliffs. That's when you see it, a glint of rusted iron poking from the soil like a tooth from an otherwise well-mannered hill. You know better, of course. It's probably a barrel hoop, or part of a very unfortunate wheelbarrow. But still, you mark the spot, quietly, just in case. Back at the house, new rumors swirl. One of Napoleon's servants is caught trying to smuggle a silver spoon. Another claims to have overheard that the bathtub was never on the island at all, that it was always symbolic, a metaphor for imperial decline wrapped in enamel and plumbing. Historians still argue whether the bathtub was ever a real presence in Napoleon's life, or simply an artifact added by bored memoirists looking for a splash of humanity. But you remember the steam, the way the floor always creaked a little under its weight, the way Napoleon hummed, not sang, hummed, when the water was just warm enough. That hum didn't sound metaphorical. The new governor, a man with eyebrows that could shelter entire birds, doesn't care for lingering ghost stories. He replaces the household staff and declares that exile should not be romanticized. The library gets locked up, the linen gets counted. The room where Napoleon died is turned into an inventory closet. No one mentions the tub. Well, not openly, but occasionally you hear it again. The phrase, the bath, always with a capital B, always delivered with a certain reverent hush, like someone referencing a relic too sacred to dust. You're invited once to a small dinner, hosted by a minor French official visiting the island for, well, no one's quite sure what for. Over boiled fish and badly interpreted jokes about Corsican weather, he leans over and asks, "Do you think the English have it?" You blink, unsure if he means the tub or something more dramatic. The bath, he clarifies, buttering a roll with the intensity of a man preparing to interrogate it. You give your usual answer. It existed, and then it didn't. Later, you notice he's packed a crate labeled Soaps, Historical. You wish him luck. A few years pass.
Some bright-eyed scholar publishes a pamphlet, Napoleon and His Bathtub, Hygiene in Exile. It's written with gusto, quoting letters that probably didn't survive sea spray, and footnotes that mostly reference other footnotes. There's even an artist rendering of what the tub might have looked like, part Roman bath, part French pastry, with a lion's head spout, and enough decorative flourishes to make Versailles blush. You're not consulted, but your neighbor, who once lent you a bar of imperial soap, insists the drawing feels wrong in the legs. Then come the reenactors. You'd think, of all things, they'd focus on battles, on uniforms, swords and hats and people yelling charge over suspiciously flat fields. But no, this group specializes in domestic moments of historical figures. One man, tall and damp-looking, sets up a replica bathtub in a field and proceeds to narrate Napoleon's imagined thoughts while pretending the scrub behind his ears. He calls it immersive history. You call it wet and weird. They film a documentary. It airs once in a Parisian cafe at midnight, then disappears like the tub itself, probably for the best. Still, the myth spreads. You hear tales of people leaving bars of soap at French monuments. Others write poems about Napoleon's last soak. One particularly intense scholar claims to have narrowed the possible resting place of the tub to 3 shipping routes, 2 dry wells, and a museum in Brussels with very nervous curators. You receive letters now, from strangers. Always the same question. Do you know where it is? Some offer money, others offer theories, a few offer sketches of what they believe the tub wanted to be. You don't answer most of them, but one night, after too much wine and a strong sense of nostalgia, you write back to one young man in Lyon. You tell him the truth, or as close to it as you remember, about the washing, the candles, the soft complaints in French, the way the tub creaked slightly when Napoleon shifted his weight, the way he once fell asleep mid-soak and had to be fished out with surprising dignity. You end the letter with this: I think it mattered to him.
not because it was a luxury, but because it was one of the last things he could control. The man replies once. Simply, that's enough. No one mentions it again for years, until, one afternoon, a crate arrives at your door. No return address, no markings, just an old dented box with one brass clawfoot sticking out the side. Inside, nothing but an empty enamel basin and a note. The note reads, "Found this in a barn near Lisbon. Thought it might be yours." You laugh, because of course it isn't. It's too small, too chipped, too unbathed in, but you polish it anyway, place a towel over the edge, sit beside it for a while, and you remember the sound of water, the soft slosh of history taking its time.
The bathtub now sits in your garden, beneath a lopsided fig tree that drops fruit with surprising violence. You've placed a small wooden sign in front of it that simply says, "Maybe." Occasionally, children from the village come by to stare at it, wide-eyed and whispering. One claims he saw a frog inside it that looked a bit like Napoleon. Another insists it smells like lavender and destiny. You don't encourage them, but you don't send them away either. By now, the bathtub has taken on a life of its own. It's no longer just an object. It's an idea, a legend soaked in enamel and enigma, a relic of comfort in a world that so rarely allowed it. And with each passing year, the stories grow stranger. You hear that someone in Vienna is selling soap, said to be made using a Napoleonic recipe. You're pretty sure that means it smells vaguely of lemon and sadness. A playwright in Prague stages a show titled Soak of the Century, which features 3 bathtubs, a ghost, and a duet performed entirely in towel slaps. A museum in Marseille opens a room dedicated to imperial hygiene, complete with wax figures and an audio track of someone exhaling meaningfully. Historians still argue whether the emperor's bathing habits tell us anything meaningful about power, vulnerability, or French plumbing. Some call it trivia. Others call it iconography. A few just want to write about something that doesn't involve cavalry charges and cannonballs. Meanwhile, you keep the fig leaves off the rim and polish the brass clawfoot once a month with an old rag and the sort of tenderness usually reserved for heirloom soup ladles. You don't know if it's the tub, but you like to think it might be, or at least that it wants to be. Then one day, a visitor arrives. She's tall, wearing a wide hat and an expression of academic concern. You know the type. Sandal laces tucked into socks, notebook already open. She introduces herself as a historical bathing consultant. You nod, slowly. This is not the strangest title you've heard. She asks many questions. What kind of enamel? What depth? Were there chips here or here? Was Napoleon more of a bath sitter or bath floater? Did he hum Marseillaise or something more sulky? You answer as best you can. You even make her tea, though it turns out she brought her own blend, something herbal and suspiciously purple. She thanks you and takes photos of the tub from every angle. At one point, she lies down in the grass to get a true bather's perspective. You offer her a cushion. She declines. Before she leaves, she asks one final question. If this is the real bathtub, why do you think it came back to you? You consider this, then shrug. Maybe it missed being useful. She writes that
Weeks pass. You think little of it, until you receive a copy of her published monograph in the mail. Reclaimed Comfort, Bathtubs and Exile in the Napoleonic Imagination. It's heavy, glossy, smells faintly of ambition and glue. Inside your garden tub is printed across 4 pages, complete with a caption, possibly the last place Napoleon ever relaxed. You think he'd like that, though he'd probably argue over the phrasing. Years go on. Your knees don't bend the way they used to. Your tea steeps longer, and the fig tree finally leans too far. and has to be propped with an old broom handle. But the tub remains. You repaint it once, soft grey blue, the colour of melancholy clouds, and line the rim with seashells gathered from the far side of the island. Tourists begin showing up. Not in droves, thankfully, but enough to be noticed. They come with maps, questions, and sometimes hats shaped like bicorns. One woman offers you 10 francs for a pebble near the tub. You refuse, but let her take one of the smaller shells. And the stories keep shifting. Someone writes a song, a gentle ballad titled Soaps of Exile. Another crafts a small sculpture out of driftwood, representing Emperor as vessel. A university in Canada invites you to speak at a symposium on the emotional topography of historical plumbing. You decline, but send a thank you note written in your very best calligraphy. Sometimes you catch yourself humming as you walk past the bathtub. Not La Marseillaise, too rousing, but a softer tune. Something slow and circular, like water, swirling after the drain is pulled. You know the tub isn't important to everyone. Most passers-by just see a big metal bowl with decorative feet. But to you, it's a symbol of humanity, of routine, of the quiet moments between the noisy ones. And maybe, just maybe, of the fact that even emperors needed a soak now and then. On rare evenings when the moon is high and the wind is soft, you light a candle and sit beside the tub. You don't talk, you just listen. To the rustle of leaves, the sigh of distant waves, and the almost audible whisper of memory. The tub doesn't answer, it never has. But somehow, it's enough.
By now, the bathtub has become something of a local icon. You never intended it to be. It just settled into the role, like a retired actor roped into a village play because everyone remembers that one time they nailed the role of tree number 2 in a school pageant. The postman leaves letters at the foot of the tub when you're not home. A child once tucked a daisy into the drain hole, and the mayor, who insists he studied architecture for 3 years, calls it a compelling object of communal stillness, which is impressive considering he once got lost in his own cellar. Sometimes you find offerings, a carved soap bar shaped like a chicken, a handwritten note that says, "Thank you for the stories," and once a folded drawing of Napoleon in a top hat riding a rubber duck. You keep that one in your kitchen. The odd thing is, no one asks you for proof anymore. No one demands documentation or provenance. They just seem content to visit, to sit, to imagine. And isn't that what most history is anyway? A kind of collective imagining, told around the fire, embellished with every retelling, softened at the edges, until even the rough parts feel like memory foam. Historians still argue whether Napoleon ever truly relaxed, or if even his moments of stillness were calculated. Did he daydream in the tub, strategize, practice monologues for imaginary Senate arguments? One scholar insists he composed an entire speech to a bar of soap named Maurice. Another claims he once used a floating duck as a miniature fleet to reenact the Battle of the Nile. You're not sure which version is true, but you do think there's something oddly soothing about a world leader who couldn't take a bath without turning it into a performance review. The year turns, the garden changes colors. One morning you find frost on the edge of the tub, and for a moment it gleams like polished silver. A friend visits and brings cinnamon bread. You eat together beside the bathtub, wrapped in cloaks, sipping tea that smells faintly of orange peel and patience. They ask, "What's next?" You smile. Probably rain. And of course, it does rain. Softly, persistently. The kind of drizzle that soaks into your thoughts without asking permission. You throw a tarp over the tub, not to keep it dry, but because it seems like the polite thing to do. The rain drums gently,
And the fig tree, tired now but loyal, offers its last few leaves like crumpled invitations to a party long ended.
Later, someone publishes a new article. Napoleon's final splash, rethinking sovereignty through soap. You skim it. It's dense, footnoted, and occasionally refers to your backyard as a liminal museo domestic site. You underline that phrase and hang it on your wall. It sounds just absurd enough to be true. One evening you're visited by a man who speaks very little. He brings with him an old wooden box and, after some polite shuffling, reveals a carved stopper. It's shaped like a lion's head, with teeth worn smooth and eyes that seem perpetually unimpressed. "I think this was his," he says. You don't ask how he knows. You don't even ask who his refers to. You just nod and place the stopper at the tub's edge. It looks right there, like it's always belonged. Time softens everything. Names fade, dates blur, and even emperors turn into bedtime trivia. But water, warm, quiet, honest, remains. Maybe that's why we cling to these stories. Not for the battles, or the speeches, or the treaties, but for the image of someone, once powerful, once exhausted, once very human, lowering themselves gently into a bath, sighing and thinking, finally. And maybe that's why this tub stayed behind. Not because it mattered, but because it mattered just enough. The garden grows wilder, the visits slow. You still polish the tub sometimes, still sit beside it when the stars are especially nosy. You talk to it now and then, not expecting a reply, just enjoying the way your voice sounds in the open air. And on the quietest nights, when the wind pauses to tie its shoelaces, and even the frogs have decided to sleep in, you rest your hand on the cool rim of the tub and whisper, "You did good." It doesn't answer, but somehow, that's still enough. With every ending, the night listens, and it has heard a different story waiting its turn. We are quietly slipping into the marble-slick world of ancient Rome, not to tour the Senate or gawk at Julius Caesar's sandals, but to take a seat, literally, on a toilet. Yes, tonight we're visiting the unsung triumph of Roman engineering, the latrine, the humble place where senators, soldiers, and toga-wearing fishmongers all went to do the same very human thing. And they did it in style. Sort of. Imagine long benches of cool marble, the soft sound of running water, and just enough graffiti to make you raise an eyebrow. You probably won't survive this, partly from second-hand embarrassment and partly because the sponge on a stick is coming for you. You shuffle across the stones of the Roman Forum at dawn, the air heavy with warm bread and last night's fish. Somewhere nearby, a fountain babbles, pigeons mutter. You're looking for the Forica, not a glamorous destination, but you've heard it's beautiful, functional, possibly haunted by the ghost of a senator who really should have eaten fewer dates. It's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The public latrines are often tucked beside bathhouses or busy markets. You'd think that would make them smell worse, but honestly, Rome's full of surprises. And to your delight or discomfort, you're greeted by smooth marble benches, cool to the touch and dotted with neat, circular holes. It's not exactly private. You're elbow to elbow with strangers. But hey, at least the seating is cold enough to remind you that you're alive. Each latrine is a kind of social salon. People chat. They debate politics, gossip about gladiators, and discuss bread prices.
all while relieving themselves. If you think small talk in elevators is awkward, imagine making eye contact with a magistrate while he adjusts his tunic mid-process. One mainstream historical fact: these latrines often had water flowing constantly beneath the seats to carry waste away. A marvel of Roman sanitation engineering. And alongside the footpath, a narrow gutter trickles gently, designed for washing the infamous tersorium, a sponge on a stick reused by, well, everyone. You stare at it like it's a medieval test you're about to fail. The humor doesn't end with awkward logistics. Look up, and you might spot a carved relief of Mercury, the god of travelers, smirking above the doorway, or maybe a mosaic on the wall showing someone mid-squat. It's all very on-brand for the Romans, who believed in facing life and digestion.
One odd tidbit: some of the latrines had designated chat corners with extended benches where friends could sit longer and keep the conversation flowing. Pun painfully intended. You sit carefully on the bench, hoping the person beside you doesn't recognize your sandals from last week's embarrassing toga accident. The marble is unforgiving, and you quietly regret not bringing a cushion like the older folks do. A man across from you reads aloud from a tiny wax tablet, probably poetry, possibly a shopping list, or maybe an ancient Yelp review of the nearby bakery. You try to look casual while reaching for the sponge stick. It's been soaking in vinegar water, allegedly for hygiene. You are not entirely convinced. Still, you smile weakly and try not to make a face. No one told you this would be part of your Roman experience. But it's a rite of passage. In a way, the toilet is more democratic than the Senate. It's also surprisingly decorative. Around the space, tiny carved faces peer out from the wall niches, some grimacing, others laughing. Maybe they're old gods. Maybe they're just the equivalent of bathroom emojis. Either way, you avoid eye contact. You glance at a bronze plaque bolted to the wall, the letters worn from years of glances just like yours. It's a reminder to pay the toilet fee. Yes, public toilets were often managed by private contractors, and yes, they could charge. Don't forget, even your bathroom break is taxable in the empire. Vespasian, the emperor, famously defended the urine tax with the phrase, pecunia non olet. Money does not stink. You're not sure if you agree, but then again, you're new here. An older woman shuffles in, nods at you, and sits without hesitation. Her dog waits by the entrance. No one flinches. It's just another day in Rome. A street musician outside plucks at a lyre, probably hoping the acoustics improve business. The sound echoes oddly around the curved stone walls. You stare at the ceiling, domed and painted with fading frescoes of vines and clouds. It's beautiful. You're inside a toilet that looks like a chapel, and for a moment, you wonder if this is what civilization is really about. Indoor plumbing and polite proximity. Someone chuckles softly at a fresh inscription being scratched into the wall. You can't read all of it, but you catch the words praetor and bean stew. It's probably scandalous. It's probably true. You rise, carefully, and move toward the basin where the sponge is rinsed. The water runs steadily. There's no soap, but you pretend there is. Everyone does. Outside, the air smells of roasting chestnuts and wet stone. Your business here is done. But in your heart, you'll always remember that time you used a bathroom with better architecture than your entire modern apartment.
You leave the latrine, stomach intact and dignity mostly preserved, only to immediately step into a small puddle left behind by an over-enthusiastic aqueduct. Your sandal squelches in a way that suggests it may never fully dry again. The sun's climbing now, spilling warm light over stone streets and the uneven geometry of tiled rooftops. But as your feet carry you down another alley, you notice something odd. Beneath your sandals, the cobblestones start to shimmer. It's not water. It's artwork. You're walking across a floor, but not just any floor. It's a mosaic, one of many that decorate the flooring of Rome's more refined latrines. Some of them are in upper-class bathhouses, others in private villas, but they all have one thing in common: a surprising level of effort put into where people put their feet. And other parts. Take, for instance, the floor in a bathhouse latrine near the Palatine Hill. At first glance, you think it's just a pattern of waves. But then you see it. A sea monster, mouth agape, clearly unimpressed with the business above its head. Beside it, a fisherman rows calmly by, presumably unaware of the digestive drama unfolding above. One mainstream historical fact: Roman latrine mosaics were often playful and not always tasteful. While some showed abstract patterns or mythological scenes, others included animals mid-defecation, exaggerated toilet users, or the odd cupid holding a sponge. Art, apparently, is whatever survives the splash zone. You crouch, discreetly, to look closer. The tiles are no bigger than your thumbnail, arranged so precisely it makes you wonder how anyone had the patience, especially for bathroom art. Then again, this was a world where even the sewer covers had patterns. Historians still argue whether these mosaics were created purely for decorative flair, or if they served as low-key public hygiene propaganda. You know, if it's nice to look at, maybe we'll all aim better. A woman sweeps past you with a basket of herbs, glancing at the floor like she sees this every day, which she probably does. You shuffle to the side and let her through, trying not to disrupt the tilework with your damp sandal prints. There's another latrine just around the corner, and this one has something new. You step inside and blink. Above your head, a ceiling mural. Painted in rich ochres and faded greens, it shows a sky filled with birds. Not pigeons, thankfully. Probably cranes, or geese, or very fancy chickens. Their wings are outstretched, and one is definitely eyeing a fig. You've now entered the realm of toilet symbolism. Birds, vines, clouds, these weren't just pretty distractions. Some scholars believe they were spiritual symbols, a gentle reminder that, even while dealing with bodily functions, you were still part of nature, the divine, and Rome's social order.
One quirky tidbit: a recently uncovered latrine in a Pompey villa had a tiny painted scene featuring a satyr. Yes, the goat-legged wine enthusiast, playing a flute while reclining beside a sponge bucket. Was it satire? A joke? A warning? We may never know, but someone commissioned it. Someone looked at a blank wall and thought, you know what this needs? A musical goat man. You're ushered along by the scent of fresh bread and fig jam. Someone nearby is making breakfast. You pass beneath a stone arch and find yourself in a courtyard. There's a tree in the center, its roots reaching toward a half-buried mosaic. More vines. A lion, possibly the world's first motivational toilet art. Be strong, be noble, and try not to miss. You notice a boy crouched beside the mosaic, tracing the tiles with his finger. He looks up and grins. Maybe he's memorizing the pattern. Maybe he's planning his own masterpiece for a future latrine. You nod and move on, not wanting to disturb the artistic process. You take a side alley, narrow and damp, where cats skitter between crates. Another mosaic, this time on a wall, shows a dolphin leaping over a sponge. You blink. You laugh. No one else does. That's fine. This is a private moment between you and the fish. As you turn a corner, a Roman senator glides past you, robes billowing, sandals perfectly dry. You don't know where he goes to do his business, but it probably has statues that look disapproving on purpose. Maybe even a servant holding a towel with your family crest embroidered on it. The rich live differently. You pause by a low step, where another mosaic hides. A stern-faced man pointing at a scroll. Above him, the Latin reads, "Cleanliness is civic duty." There's a small stain where someone ignored the advice. You wonder briefly how long it took the artist to finish this one. Did they sketch while the marble was being laid? Did they ever get tired of laying blue tile after blue tile? Did they know this piece of art would outlive empires and legacies and everyone's favorite fish sauce? You move on, the sun now fully risen and your thoughts still tangled in colored stone.
You find yourself thinking, there's something comforting about a society that made its toilets beautiful, as if acknowledging that even in your most awkward squatting moments, you deserved a bit of art, a bit of joy, a bit of weird dolphin humor. You take a final glance at the mosaic behind you, its tiles catching the morning light, gleaming like Roman glass, and you step forward, ready to discover what other toilet decorations this empire decided were worth preserving.
You leave behind the shimmering tiles and fish-themed jokes, weaving through the streets of Rome as the day stretches open like a sun-warmed scroll. The noise rises with it, vendors shouting, donkeys clopping, and somewhere, always, someone playing a flute as though auditioning for the role of person who ruins naps. You're getting used to the rhythm, to the cobbled chaos that somehow still manages to function like a very messy but determined play. And speaking of plays, Roman toilets weren't just pretty, they were social. You follow a narrow alley that opens onto a modest building with a crumbling brick facade and the faint scent of lavender soap trying, unsuccessfully, to overpower the more robust notes of human activity. Inside, there's a public latrine. Not private, not enclosed, just a long marble bench with strategically carved keyhole shapes, neatly arranged in 2 rows, facing each other. Congratulations, you've entered the communal phase of your Roman bathroom education. You sit, not because you need to, but because you're trying to understand the appeal. Your knees almost touch the invisible knees of the ghost across from you, and there's absolutely no door, or partition, or shame. People came here to relieve themselves and catch up on local politics, maybe place a bet, maybe argue about grain prices or theater performances. Think of it as the Roman version of a coffee shop, but with fewer lattes and more sponges on sticks. That, by the way, is your next discovery. There's a stone trough running just beneath the bench, and in it rests a wooden stick. Attached to the end is what looks like a sea sponge. Wet, slightly grimy, absolutely communal. Mainstream fact time. The tersorium, as it was called, was the Roman version of toilet paper. Shared, dipped in water, and cleaned, ideally, with vinegar or salt water between uses. Hygiene was flexible. Some places were better than others. And yes, there's debate about whether it was 1 sponge per latrine or 1 sponge per person. You sincerely hope it was the latter. Historians still argue whether the Romans saw this as efficient sanitation or just a deeply flawed attempt at thrift. You lean back and look at the graffiti carved into the wall behind you. Latin phrases scratched by long-gone hands. Some are philosophical. Everyone is equal here. Others are rude. Lucius can't aim. And some are just confusing. Beware the sponge thief. You run your fingers over the faded words, wondering if they were carved out of boredom, protest, or just one too many lentils at lunch. Next to you, a woman with a basket full of amphorae lowers herself on.
You step out into the sun again, blinking.
A few steps away, children are playing with hoops made of bent iron. One stops to shout something about a sponge. You move on, quickly. Your next stop is an upscale villa. Maybe you're lost, maybe you're trespassing. Either way, the doors are open and curiosity is your passport. Inside, the latrine is in its own little alcove, private, shaded, with a small painted fresco of Venus and a jug of roses. You look down and see the bench is made of polished travertine, the holes delicately rounded. There's even a little shelf for oil jars and perfume. This is toilet luxury. This is toilet ambition. There's a bronze plaque above the bench and it reads, "May your passage be smooth." You nod in respect. Someone put thought into this. You wonder who cleaned these spaces, who maintained the pipes and swept the floors. The answer, more often than not, was a fuller, a professional who also did laundry, often using urine as a cleaning agent. You know this because, once again, the Romans managed to turn bodily function into business. Urine was collected from jars placed outside homes and sold to fullers. Yes, sold. There was even a urine tax. That's not a joke. Vespasian, emperor and economy enthusiast, actually taxed public urinals. The phrase, money doesn't stink, pecunia non olet, comes from that. You try not to think about it as you pass a jar near someone's doorstep and give it a wide berth. You walk through the Subura district now, where the buildings lean in close, and every third shop sells some kind of fish product. A man tries to sell you oysters. Another offers a sponge. You decline both. You duck into a small tavern, more for the shade than the wine. There's a toilet in the back, barely more than a hole in the ground, with 2 polished stones on either side. But above it, a painting. A goddess, robed and serene, holding a laurel wreath in one hand and a sponge in the other. Her name, scratched faintly into the plaster, Dea Cloacina, goddess of the sewer, guardian of sanitation. Possibly the least glamorous divine portfolio, and yet, here she is. You leave an offering, a pebble, neatly placed on the bench, just in case she's watching. As you walk back into the street, the smells intensify. A sewer channel runs beneath your feet, covered by slabs of stone, and somewhere beneath that, the great Cloaca Maxima, the main Roman sewer, is humming along, carrying the empire's secrets downstream. You walk faster now, nose wrinkled, heart oddly full. Because for all their flaws and questionable sponge policies, the Romans believed in infrastructure. They believed in marble toilets.
You follow the sound of running water, not a majestic fountain this time, but the steady rhythmic gurgle of the Roman sewer system doing its quiet work. Beneath your feet, the Cloaca Maxima winds like an underground river of civic responsibility. It's not glamorous, but is doing more for your health than the basilisk amulet around your neck ever will. Unless the basilisk also eats waste, which frankly would be helpful. You pause at a grate in the ground. A little mist rises. Somewhere down there, centuries of Roman leftovers are journeying toward the Tiber. You offer a polite nod, respect where it's due, but your destination lies uphill, toward one of Rome's more exclusive neighborhoods. Not everyone had to brave the public sponge stick ordeal after all. If you were rich, really rich, you had a private toilet. Inside, with a door, possibly with an attendant, possibly with incense, and definitely with opinions about your diet. You pass through a vine-draped archway and into the home of a senator. It's not breaking and entering if you're just curious, right? His villa is a marvel. Mosaic floors, frescoed walls, marble columns, and yes, his very own latrina domestica. You peek in. It's a small room, tucked beside the kitchen for reasons no one has adequately explained. There's a single seat, carved of white marble, with a carefully sloped opening that feeds directly into a private drainage shaft. No line, no neighbors, no sponge thief graffiti. And it's decorated. Of course it is. The walls bear painted garlands, and above the seat, a small niche holds a statuette, possibly of Fortuna, goddess of luck. Or maybe it's a local deity dedicated to, let's say, smooth transitions. The scholars haven't reached consensus. One mainstream fact, elite Romans often built their toilets near their dining rooms. You wrinkle your nose at that particular architectural decision, but hey, it was efficient. Close proximity, less walking, also a strange kind of social signal. Look how luxurious my waste disposal is. Nothing says power like custom plumbing. A servant walks past the doorway carrying a basket of figs. He doesn't even blink at you. Apparently, people standing and staring into toilets is just another Tuesday. You back away and return to the street, which is quieter now.
the midday sun pushing people indoors. You find shade beneath a portico where a small child is drawing something in chalk on the pavement. You look closer. It's a toilet with wings. You raise an eyebrow. The child grins. You move on. Down another alley, past the fishmongers and the sandal repair stalls, you stumble upon a latrine with carved signage above the door. It's not Latin, or at least not only Latin, it looks Greek. You realize you've entered the multicultural corner of the city, where merchants from the east have brought not just spices and textiles, but their own toilet traditions.
This one has a low bench with smooth cutouts, and it's surrounded by small painted tiles. Each tile is different. A lyre, a laughing mask, a peacock feather, a loaf of bread. You're not entirely sure what story they tell, but it's whimsical. The floor is swept, the basin smells faintly of myrrh, and there's even a cup of petals near the entrance. This is bathroom meets gallery meets shrine. And you wonder, were toilets also used as informal temples? Historians still argue whether certain latrines doubled as sacred spaces, especially for lesser gods or household spirits known as lares and penates. In a society where gods governed everything from grain to gossip, it wouldn't be surprising if some minor deity handled digestion. You hear laughter from the other side of a stone wall, and for a moment, you think of how many conversations must have started in these places. Not deep philosophical ones, not treaties, but gossip, rumors, confessions. Imagine the secret crushes confessed between tile breaks, the political jokes whispered over the splash of a sponge bucket, the matchmaking, the eavesdropping, all of it, lost to time and sewer sediment. A fringe tidbit floats to mind. Some scholars believe that Roman emperors received informal petitions, written on wax tablets or bits of cloth, tucked secretly into the nooks of public toilets. Not exactly the royal inbox, but if you needed to be discreet, it's hard to beat a spot everyone pretends not to look at. You pass by a food stall selling honey cakes and mulled wine. You pause. Not for a snack, but because behind it stands a freestanding latrine, a single-seat, wooden-structured thing meant for travelers. You step inside and marvel. It's simple, sure, but carved into the back wall is a poem, badly spelled, rhythm questionable, but heartfelt. It goes something like, "O seat of rest, you hold me best, while troubles pass, through tail and chest." You nod, impressed. Romans really could find poetry anywhere. As you wander again through the quieter streets, you notice a curious thing. Every few blocks, there's some marker, an old pipe, a broken step, a pattern in the stone that hints at the city's hidden plumbing, like nerves beneath skin. Rome didn't just function on power and parades, it ran on water, waste, and the people who made sure the toilets didn't back up during Saturnalia. And now, your eyes catch a glimmer of something new. Gold leaf, faint but real, embedded into a mural above a long-forgotten bench. It shows a reclining man, naked except for a laurel crown, raising a cup in one hand while the other gestures to a toilet. You can't tell if he's toasting the invention or warning against overuse. Either way, it's fabulous. You sit nearby, finally tired. The mural watches you with its smug golden grin, and you begin to think that maybe this is where the artist meant. The Romans could have left it plain, could have made their toilets dark, grimy, and purely functional. But instead, they made them beautiful, or funny, or reflective. Because even in moments where everything else drops away, dignity, pretense, clean sandals, there's still room for story, for art, for shared humanity.
You're still sitting there, head tilted, eyes half-lidded, letting the quiet hum of the city wrap around you like a warm wool cloak. It's hard to believe how much Rome could say, through pipes and plaster and sponge handles. And yet here you are, slowly absorbing a civilization by following its plumbing. You stretch your legs and rise, brushing imaginary dust from your tunic. A breeze slips through the alley, carrying with it the scent of olive oil and, less charmingly, wet limestone. You follow the winding path toward one last place, a name whispered by a fishmonger with too many teeth and not enough boundaries. Thermae Diocletiani. The baths of Diocletian. Grand, marble everywhere, and of course, facilities to match. When you step inside, it's like entering a temple to comfort. The air smells faintly of eucalyptus. Voices echo gently through the vaulted ceiling, not quite loud enough to intrude. And the latrine area? Magnificent. A series of seats arranged semicircularly like some dignified toilet symposium. Carvings of dolphins leap along the walls, and overhead, small glass windows catch the sun and scatter it like gold dust across the floor. You sit once more, not to use the space, but to marvel. Because even in this sacred spa of sweat and steam, the Romans brought artistry to the mundane. There are floral motifs around the drain holes. The sponge trough is edged with delicate scrollwork, and someone, bless them, has carved a tiny cupid riding a goose just above the waist channel. You don't know why, but you deeply appreciate the effort. One mainstream fact that slips into your brain now like a well-timed footnote. Roman sanitation was so advanced that certain modern European cities didn't catch up until the 19th century. 19th. Let that sink in. For all their faults, conquest, slavery, gladiators, the Romans figured out how to clean their cities before most of modern Europe figured out forks. The fringe tidbit today. Some Roman houses, especially in the provinces, had portable chamber pots made of fine ceramic, often decorated with little scenes. Not of toilets, but of daily life. Gardeners, musicians, birds. You imagine someone squatting over an image of a lyre player and think, yes, that's exactly the kind of duality the Romans thrived on. But as you sit here, letting the afternoon light warm your face and the quiet settle in again, you start to feel something beyond the jokes, beyond the mosaics, beyond the clever plumbing. You start to feel the people. Not the emperors or generals, but the washerwoman who scribbled a complaint in the plaster above a latrine. The mason who chose to inlay a dolphin tile instead of just another plain square. The servant who lit the oil lamp near the bathhouse bench. The kid who scratched "Lucius smells" behind the sponge bucket and then ran away giggling. Historians still argue whether toilets were ever truly private in ancient Rome, or whether they were always places of performance, like everything else in that grand, chaotic city. And maybe it doesn't matter, because even in their most vulnerable moments, Romans left their mark, sometimes literally, with charcoal or red ink, or less poetically, in a clogged drain. You rise and walk slowly back toward the edge of the forum. The stones feel warm under your soles. A pigeon flaps lazily overhead, and a merchant calls out something about turnips, but you don't hear him clearly. Your mind is still with the underground rivers and painted ceilings, the whispered jokes and sponge politics. And then, unexpectedly, you see it. A new mosaic. Recent. Modern, even. A careful recreation of an ancient Roman latrine scene, tucked near a museum entrance. A plaque reads, "To remind us that every civilization begins with how it handles waste." You smile, because while you didn't expect to spend the day exploring ancient toilets, you now feel more connected to Rome than any marble statue or gilded helmet ever made you feel. Because this messy, awkward, practical part of life isn't just about sanitation. It's about creativity, humor, humanity, and a universal truth that transcends centuries. Nobody escapes bathroom logistics. You turn to leave, but pause. One last sponge rests in a museum case nearby, lovingly preserved, slightly frayed, gloriously ordinary. You give it a respectful nod. It's earned it.